Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I've stayed in more hotels than I can count over the years. Business trips, vacations, you name it. They all start to blur together after a while. The same sterile hallways, identical rooms with bland decor, and that faint, unidentifiable smell that seems to linger no matter where you are. But there's one hotel I'll never forget, one night that still keeps me up when I think about it too much. It was supposed to be just another business trip, but what happened there made me swear off hotels for good. I was in a small town for a client meeting, staying at a place called the Overlook Inn. It was one of those old-fashioned hotels that tried to hold on to its charm, but just came off as outdated. Faded carpets, dim lighting, and that slight musty odor that clung to everything. I wasn't thrilled about it, but it was the only place with rooms available on short notice. The receptionist was a tired-looking woman who barely glanced at me as she handed over the key. "Room 616, she said without looking up. "Top floor, end of the hall." I nodded, took the key, and headed to the elevator. As the doors closed, I noticed the receptionist watching me. A strange look on her face, like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the long day I'd had, and stepped out onto the 6th floor. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the kind of lighting that makes everything look a little too shadowy. The carpet was a faded red, with intricate patterns that had long since lost their vibrancy. The doors were evenly spaced, each one identical with brass numbers and scuffed paint. I walked down the hall, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet. I reached room 616 at the very end. The door looked the same as all the others, but as I put the key in the lock, I noticed the number 616 was slightly askew, as if it had been removed and hastily put back on. I didn't think much of it at the time and pushed the door open. The room was exactly what I expected, a small, bland space with a bed, a desk, a TV that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s, and a large window with heavy curtains drawn shut. I tossed my bag on the bed and immediately went to the window, pulling back the curtains to let in some light. The view wasn't much, just the parking lot and the darkening sky beyond. I turned on the TV for some background noise, hoping to drown out the emptiness of the room. It flickered to life, the screen filled with static for a moment before settling on an old rerun of some sitcom. I sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through my phone, trying to relax before my meeting the next morning. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like a soft rhythmic tapping. I paused, listening, but the noise stopped. I figured it was just the pipes or maybe someone in the room next door. I shrugged it off and continued scrolling, but a few minutes later, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, like something tapping against glass. I looked around the room, my eyes landing on the window. The curtains were still pulled back, and the glass was clear, nothing out of the ordinary. I walked over and peered out, but all I saw was my reflection in the dark parking lot beyond. The tapping had stopped again, and the room was silent except for the low hum of the TV. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just my nerves. But then, just as I turned away, I saw it, a faint outline on the glass, like the impression of a hand. It was there for only a second before fading, leaving the window clear once more. My stomach churned, but I told myself it was just condensation, a trick of the light. I closed the curtains and sat back down, my heart pounding a little harder now. I focused on the TV, trying to distract myself, but the noise started up again, louder this time. The tapping had moved, now coming from the bathroom, steady and deliberate. It sounded like fingernails lightly drumming against tile. My skin prickled with unease. I didn't want to check, but I knew I had to. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to guide me, and slowly approached the bathroom door. The tapping continued, rhythmic and relentless, echoing softly against the tile. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, then took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, small, dingy, with a flickering overhead light that cast unsettling shadows. The shower curtain was drawn halfway closed, and the sink dripped slowly, each drop echoing in the quiet. I swept the light across the room, but there was nothing, no sign of what could have made the noise. I stood there for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest, before backing out and shutting the door. I went back to the bed, telling myself it was just the hotel's old plumbing acting up. I turned up the TV, hoping to drown out any more sounds, but the tapping resumed, louder and faster now, coming from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was like the sound was inside my head. I grabbed my bag and decided I'd had enough. I wasn't staying another second in that room. I bolted for the door, but when I tried to open it, the knob wouldn't budge. I twisted and pulled, but it was like the door was glued shut. Panic set in as I yanked harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw movement. The curtains by the window were slowly parting, even though there was no breeze, no reason for them to move. I turned, and there, standing just behind the sheer fabric, was a figure. It was tall, its shape vaguely human but wrong, twisted, like a shadow that didn't belong. It pressed against the glass, its outline shimmering and faint, but undeniably there. I backed away, my mind racing. The tapping grew louder, now a frantic, chaotic drumming that filled the room, drowning out everything else. The figure at the window didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, locked onto me. I scrambled back, hitting the wall, and that's when the lights went out. I was plunged into darkness, the tapping replaced by a low guttural whisper that seemed to seep from the walls. It was a language I couldn't understand, guttural and harsh, like 100 voices speaking at once. The figure at the window was gone, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. Desperation clawed at me as I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to sweep the room. The beam flickered and died almost immediately, leaving me blind and terrified. I felt along the wall, trying to find the light switch, but my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, a hand, slender and impossibly long, reaching out from the darkness. I jerked back, slamming into the bed, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the cold fingers creeping closer, brushing against my arm, my neck. I stumbled to the door, my hands shaking as I tried the knob again. This time it turned, and I flung the door open, bolting down the hallway without looking back. I didn't stop running until I was in the lobby, gasping for breath. The receptionist was there, staring at me with wide eyes. "You were in room 616, weren't you?" she asked quietly, almost as if she already knew the answer. I nodded, too shaken to speak. She sighed, her expression a mix of sympathy and resignation. "That room, it's not supposed to be occupied. We've tried to close it off, but the system keeps assigning it. No one should stay there. Ever." I demanded to know why, but she just shook her head. "No one knows what really happened, but people who stay in that room, they say it's like something's trapped there, something that doesn't want to be forgotten." I checked out immediately, refusing the receptionist's offer to switch rooms. I drove through the night, putting as much distance between me and the Overlook Inn as I could. When I finally got home, I swore I'd never set foot in that place again. A week later, I decided to look up the hotel's history, and what I found made my blood run cold. Decades ago, a guest in room 616 had gone missing, never to be found. The only clue was a series of strange, rhythmic marks on the window, like someone had been tapping from the inside, trying to get out. To this day, I avoid old hotels, and I never stay on the 6th floor, no matter where I am. Because every once in a while, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear it. The faint, persistent tapping, like a memory that refuses to fade, calling me back to room 616. I've always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries, the kind that send shivers down your spine and make you question what's real. So when I heard about the string of disappearances in the small town of Dry Creek, I couldn't resist digging deeper. It started with one or two people vanishing, but soon entire families were gone without a trace. The authorities had no leads, no clues, just empty houses and unanswered questions. The weird part? The town itself seemed to be disappearing too. Reports came in of people driving through Dry Creek and finding nothing but empty streets and boarded-up buildings, even though it was still marked on maps. It was like the place was slowly fading from existence, taking its residents with it. I decided to take a trip there, figuring I'd spend a day exploring and see what I could find. I'm not a journalist or a detective, just someone with a curiosity that often gets the better of me. I packed my camera, some snacks, and a flashlight just in case, and set out on the 3-hour drive to Dry Creek. As I got closer, I noticed the landscape changing. The trees grew denser, their branches twisted and bare. Even though it was late summer, the sky seemed to darken, clouds hanging low and heavy, blocking out the sun. By the time I reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, it felt like I was driving into a different world, one where light struggled to reach. The town was just as eerie as I'd read about, empty streets, houses with windows covered in grime, and the occasional flickering streetlight casting a sickly glow. There were no signs of life, no cars, no people. It was as if everyone had just up and left. I parked my car on what looked like the main street and stepped out, the silence pressing in from all sides. I started walking, my footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. The buildings were in various states of decay, with doors hanging off hinges and roofs caved in. It was hard to believe this place had been a bustling town not too long ago. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures, documenting the emptiness. As I wandered deeper into the town, I noticed something odd. The street signs were missing, and the numbers on the houses were faded or gone entirely. It was like the town didn't want to be found, like it was erasing itself bit by bit. I passed by a diner with dusty windows and a neon sign that flickered weakly, the letters spelling out "open," even though it clearly wasn't. I decided to check out the diner, hoping to find some clues or at least a place to rest for a moment. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the smell of stale air and mildew hitting me like a wall. Inside, the place was frozen in time. Plates and cups still sat on the tables, covered in a thick layer of dust, as if the diners had just vanished in the middle of their meals. A jukebox in the corner stood silent, its once bright colors dulled by years of neglect. I walked to the counter and found a newspaper, yellowed and brittle. The date was from 2 years ago, right around the time the disappearances started. The front page headline read, "Family of 4 missing, no leads." There was a grainy photo of a family, smiling and happy. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I was probably standing where they had once sat. I put the newspaper down and was about to leave when I heard it, a faint sound, like static, coming from the jukebox. It started softly, then grew louder, the static turning into garbled voices, overlapping and indistinct. I stared at the jukebox, my heart racing, as the voices continued, almost like they were arguing or calling for help. I backed away, my hand on the door, and as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The jukebox was silent again, its lights flickering once before going dark. I stepped outside, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I decided to keep moving, sticking to the main road that wound through the center of town. The further I went, the stranger things became. The air felt thicker, like I was walking through water, and the light seemed to fade, even though it was only mid-afternoon. I could swear I heard faint whispers, like the wind was trying to tell me something, but the words were just out of reach. Then I noticed the first sign of life, sort of, a dog, or what I thought was a dog at first, standing at the end of the street. Its fur was matted and patchy, and it stared at me with eyes that were too human, too knowing. It turned and disappeared around a corner before I could get a better look. I followed, my curiosity piqued despite the gnawing fear in my gut. I turned the corner, and found myself facing a row of houses, all identical, like copies pasted in a line. In front of each house stood a figure, people but not quite. They were pale, almost translucent, their faces blank and devoid of features. They stood perfectly still, their heads tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. They didn't move, didn't react to me at all. I raised my camera and took a photo, the flash briefly illuminating the scene. When I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. The figures were gone, the houses were empty, the street deserted. I looked up and they were still there, staring without eyes, without expression. I backed away, my hands shaking, and that's when I heard it. The whispers, louder now, coming from all directions. They were clearer, almost like a chant, repeating a phrase over and over. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing off the pavement. The town seemed to stretch and twist around me, the streets shifting in ways that didn't make sense. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't find my way back to my car. Every turn led me deeper into the maze of empty buildings and silent streets. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled into what looked like a town square, its centerpiece a tall, rusted clock tower that loomed over the empty space. The clock was stuck at 3:15, its hands motionless. I leaned against a bench, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I saw them, the missing people. They were all there, standing around the square, their faces turned toward the clock tower. There were men, women, children, all dressed in clothes that looked dated, like they belonged to different eras. They stood in silence, their eyes blank and unfocused, as if they were sleepwalking. I called out to them, my voice cracking with fear. "Hello? Can you hear me? What happened here?" No one answered. They just stood there, staring at the clock tower. I walked closer, trying to get their attention, but it was like I didn't exist to them. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The faces I'd seen in the diner, in the newspaper, were among them. The smiling family, now blank and empty, lost in the crowd. I turned to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt like the ground was holding me in place, pulling me down. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices all around me, blending into a single overwhelming plea, "Stay." I struggled, my heart racing, but it was like the air had turned solid, trapping me in place. The figures began to move, slowly turning toward me, their heads tilting in unison. They took a step forward, then another, closing in from all sides. In a blind panic, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment, everything froze. The figures stopped, the whispers ceased, and I felt the pressure around me lift. I bolted, the light guiding my way as I sprinted through the town. The buildings blurred past, the streets twisting and turning until finally I saw my car. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and sped away, not looking back. When I reached the highway, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the landscape. It felt like I'd been gone for hours, but when I checked the time, only 15 minutes had passed since I'd first entered Dry Creek. I tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed me. They said the town had been abandoned for decades, that no one had lived there for years. I showed them the photos I took, but they were just pictures of empty streets and overgrown buildings. No figures, no faces, just a ghost town. But I know what I saw, and I know the missing people are still there, trapped in that place where time doesn't move, and the town keeps calling for more. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I swear I can hear the whispers again, faint and distant, like the town is reaching out, still searching for those who might listen. I keep my car doors locked now, and I avoid any detours that might take me near Dry Creek. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. A place caught between worlds, where the missing aren't just lost, they're taken. Camping was always my go-to escape. When life got too hectic, nothing cleared my mind like a few days in the wilderness, away from the noise and pressures of everyday life. So when my friends bailed on our planned camping trip to Pine Hollow Forest, I decided to go alone. I'd been there a dozen times before and knew the trails like the back of my hand. A solo adventure sounded perfect. Just me, nature, and a quiet weekend to recharge. I arrived at the forest late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows between the tall pines. The air was crisp and cool, carrying that distinct earthy scent of fallen leaves and fresh pine needles. I parked my car at the trailhead, grabbed my gear, and set off down the familiar path that wound deeper into the forest. After a couple of hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, far enough off the main trail to feel secluded, but not so deep that I'd get lost. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and soon had a cozy fire crackling in the growing darkness. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude, the stars just beginning to peek through the canopy above. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But as the night wore on, I started to feel off. The usual forest sounds seemed muted, and every once in a while, I thought I heard something faint, like distant whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I brushed it off as the wind, convincing myself that I was just jittery from being alone. But the longer I sat there, the more the unease grew. The whispers continued, soft and unintelligible, almost like the forest itself was murmuring secrets. I decided it was just my imagination playing tricks on me and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut against the night. I lay there listening to the faint crackling of the dying fire, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to be coming from all around, faint and insistent, blending with the rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just the wind, but something about it felt wrong. It was rhythmic, like a chant, rising and falling in a way that didn't match the natural sounds of the forest. I tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, a particularly loud whisper would snap me back to alertness. I turned on my flashlight and shined it around inside the tent, half expecting to see something, anything that could explain the noise, but there was nothing but the dim glow of the tent walls and the rustle of fabric as I moved. I lay back down, staring up at the roof of the tent, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching me from the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost make out words. They were still too faint to understand, but the tone was urgent, like someone desperately trying to get my attention. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I shined my flashlight into the trees, scanning the darkness. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the thick trunks and low-hanging branches, but there was nothing there. Just the dense forest and the oppressive silence. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with long, spindly limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. My heart was racing, and I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, my tired mind playing games. But the whispers continued, louder now, like a chorus of voices surrounding me. I backed toward the fire, trying to make out the words, but they were just beyond comprehension, a jumble of sounds that set my teeth on edge. I threw more wood on the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting long shadows that danced and flickered. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of the figure, but saw nothing. Just the endless rows of pines and the deep, impenetrable darkness between them. I decided I couldn't stay there. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if protesting my decision to leave. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started back toward the trail, the beam of my flashlight bouncing with each hurried step. The forest seemed different now, the familiar path twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I tried to keep calm, telling myself to just follow the trail, but it was like the forest was shifting around me, changing with every step. The whispers followed, no longer faint but loud and clear, coming from every direction. They were angry now, demanding, the words sharp and biting. I picked up the pace, almost running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the endless forest and the shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then the trail disappeared. One moment I was on it, the next I was stumbling through dense underbrush, branches snagging my clothes and scratching my face. I spun around, trying to find my way back, but the path was gone, swallowed by the forest. Panic set in. I had no idea where I was, and the whispers were deafening now, echoing in my ears, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. I stumbled through the trees, my flashlight flickering as the battery began to die. I felt like I was going in circles, the forest closing in around me. Then, out of nowhere, I tripped and fell, the flashlight flying from my hand. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. I lay there, dazed, staring up at the canopy of trees. The whispers were all around me, a swirling mass of voices, and through the chaos I heard one word clearly. Stay. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight, but it was dead. I was plunged into darkness, the forest pressing in on all sides. I could feel the eyes watching me, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, my arms outstretched to fend off the branches. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I broke through the trees and stumbled onto the main trail. I could see the faint glow of the parking lot lights in the distance, and I sprinted toward them, my heart pounding. I didn't stop until I reached my car, practically diving inside and locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, my mind racing. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the familiar hum of the engine and the soft glow of the dashboard lights. I drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I finally made it home, I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head, a mix of exhaustion, fear, and the eerie stillness of the forest at night. But deep down, I knew better. Something was in those woods, something that didn't want me to leave. The next day, I checked the news, half expecting to see something about strange occurrences at Pine Hollow. But there was nothing, just the usual headlines. I did some research, trying to find any stories about the forest, but all I found were mentions of hikers getting lost and occasional sightings of strange figures. I haven't been back to Pine Hollow since, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I swear I can still hear those whispers, faint and distant, calling me back to the place where the trees move and the forest doesn't let you go. And I know that whatever is out there is still waiting, still watching, biding its time until the next unlucky camper steps off the path and into the whispering woods. Working as a ranger in Redwood National Park was supposed to be a dream job. I'd always loved the outdoors, the peace of the forest, the towering trees that made the world feel small. The park was like a cathedral, with its ancient redwoods reaching skyward, their massive trunks a testament to centuries gone by. I'd been there a year and felt like I knew every trail, every hidden grove, every sound that the forest had to offer. But there was one area I avoided, a dense section of the forest known as the Screaming Pines. It wasn't an official name, just a nickname passed around by the rangers, a place steeped in rumor and unease. The Screaming Pines were an out-of-the-way patch of the park where the redwoods grew so thick that the sunlight barely touched the ground. It was said that the trees there would whisper, creak, and, on rare occasions, scream when the wind blew just right. No one liked going near the Screaming Pines, and most days we didn't have to. The tourists stuck to the main trails, and there was little reason to venture into that part of the forest. But then came the call. A family had reported a missing hiker, someone who'd wandered off the path and hadn't been seen for hours. My supervisor, Dave, assigned me to the search, pairing me up with another ranger, Sarah, who'd been at the park longer than I had. "We'll start at the main trail and work our way out," Sarah said, checking her map. "But if he went too far off, we might have to go through the pines." I nodded, trying to hide my unease. We set off, the sun high in the sky, filtering through the canopy in golden beams. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals, but the deeper we went, the quieter it became. As we neared the screaming pines, the air grew heavy, the usual forest sounds fading into an unnatural silence. We called out for the missing hiker, our voices echoing off the towering trees, but there was no response. Just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the forest floor and the occasional creak of the ancient trunks around us. Sarah stopped, pointing ahead. "There's the boundary." The boundary of the screaming pines was unmistakable. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangled in a twisted mess that blocked out the light. The air felt colder, the shadows deeper, and the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. "Stay close," Sarah said, her voice low. "And if you hear anything, don't go chasing it." I followed her lead, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as we crossed into the pines. The trees here were different, not the proud, towering redwoods, but sickly, twisted pines with dark, gnarled branches. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, muffling our footsteps. We moved slowly, scanning the area for any sign of the missing hiker. I kept my eyes on the ground, looking for tracks, but all I found were deep, old roots twisting through the soil. As we pressed on, the wind began to pick up, rustling the branches above us. The sound was eerie, like the forest itself was whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. And then it started, a faint, high-pitched sound like a distant wail carried on the wind. It was so soft at first that I thought I'd imagined it, but then it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that sounded almost human. Sarah stopped, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "That's the sound," she said quietly. "The pines are alive. It's just the trees." But I wasn't so sure. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone or something was out there, calling for help. It echoed through the forest, rising and falling, mingling with the creaking of the branches until it became a chorus of dissonant cries. We pressed on, the wailing growing louder with each step. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning in as if watching our every move. I kept my flashlight trained on the path ahead, but the beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. Then we saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, thin, and wrapped in what looked like dark clothing. Its head bowed as if it were staring at the ground. I felt a surge of hope, thinking it might be the missing hiker. "Hey," I called out, stepping forward. But Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Wait," she hissed, her voice sharp with fear. "Look closer." I squinted, trying to make out the figure through the gloom. And that's when I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a tree, one of the pines, its trunk twisted into a shape that eerily resembled a human figure. The head was just a knotted mass of wood, and the clothing was dark moss clinging to its bark. But the wailing continued, louder now, filling the air with its mournful sound. I shined my flashlight around, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. My pulse quickened, and a deep sense of dread settled over me. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Now." We turned to leave, but the path we had come down was gone. The trees had shifted, their trunks pressing closer together, forming a wall of twisted branches. I felt my heart race as I looked around, realizing we were surrounded. The pines had us trapped. The wailing grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the sound vibrating through my bones. It wasn't just noise. It was a cry for help, a desperate plea that pulled at my mind, urging me to go deeper, to follow the sound to its source. "We're not alone here," I whispered, my breath fogging in the cold air. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "The pines take people," she said, her voice barely audible. "That's why no one comes here. The legend, they say the forest traps souls, that the trees are filled with them." I tried to stay calm, but the screaming, it wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and intertwining, forming a symphony of sorrow that echoed through the forest. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging at my very being. We started to move, pushing through the dense branches, trying to find a way out. But the trees seemed to shift with every step, blocking our path, guiding us deeper into the forest. I called out, my voice breaking, but the wailing drowned out everything else. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure flickering between the trees, almost human but not quite. It moved with unnatural speed, darting through the shadows. I turned, trying to follow it with my flashlight, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "We're not alone," I said again, my voice shaking. Sarah's grip tightened on my arm. "Keep moving. Don't stop." We pushed on, the wailing now deafening, echoing in our ears like a terrible, never-ending scream. The forest around us felt alive, the trees shifting and groaning as if reacting to our presence. My flashlight flickered, the battery draining faster than it should, plunging us into near darkness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled into a small clearing. The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the pines loomed all around us, their branches twisted like claws, and there at the center of the clearing was the missing hiker, or what was left of him. He was half buried in the ground, his body twisted and contorted, his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes were wide, staring up at the sky, frozen in a look of sheer terror. His skin was pale, his clothes torn and covered in dirt and pine needles. Sarah gasped, stumbling back. "Oh, God!" I wanted to move, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the body, from the look of absolute horror etched into his face. The ground around him was littered with bones, old and new, half buried in the soil. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We turned, but the trees were closing in, their branches reaching out like hands. The wailing started up again, louder than ever, filling the air with its piercing, mournful sound. I felt it in my chest, a terrible, aching pull that made it hard to breathe. We stumbled back the way we came, crashing through the undergrowth, the trees seeming to shift and sway around us. I didn't know which direction we were going anymore. I just knew we had to get away from the screams, away from the pines. After what felt like hours, we broke through the tree line, stumbling onto one of the main trails. The wailing stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving us in stunned silence. I looked back, expecting to see the twisted trees of the screaming pines, but they were gone. Just the ordinary forest, quiet and still. We radioed for help, and a search team arrived within the hour. They found the body in the clearing, but there was no sign of the twisted trees, no sign of the shadows we had seen, just an old unmarked grave where the hiker had fallen. The coroner ruled it an accident, lost, disoriented, died of exposure. But Sarah and I knew better. We had seen what the pines could do. We had heard the screams of the lost, the souls trapped in the twisted branches of the forest. We never spoke of it again, and I never went back to that part of the park. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear it. The faint, distant wail of the screaming pines carried on the wind. A reminder that some parts of the forest are better left alone. Because once the pines take you, they never let go. When I first took the job at the Riverside Inn, it seemed like the perfect escape. I was fresh out of college, broke, and looking for something to get me out of the city. The inn was a charming old place, a beautiful, sprawling Victorian house that had been converted into a hotel decades ago. Nestled by the river, surrounded by thick woods, it was exactly the kind of peaceful, quiet setting I needed. The inn's owner, Mrs. Hargrove, was an elderly woman with a stern face and a no-nonsense attitude. She didn't seem thrilled about hiring me at first, but I guess she was desperate for help. The place was big, and she was getting too old to manage it on her own. I was just grateful for the job and the free room in the staff quarters. Mind the guests, keep the place tidy, and never ever go into room 9, she warned me on my first day, her gray eyes narrowing. That room is off limits. Understand? I nodded, not thinking much of it. Every old inn has its quirks, and a locked room wasn't the strangest thing I'd heard of. Mrs. Hargrove didn't explain, and I didn't ask. I had plenty to keep me busy, between checking in guests, cleaning rooms, and helping with the maintenance. At first, things were quiet. The inn was half empty most of the time, its best years clearly behind it. Guests came and went, and I settled into a routine, enjoying the solitude of the place. But room 9 kept nagging at me, a mystery that I couldn't quite shake. It was the last room on the left, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway on the second floor. I'd pass it every day during my rounds, the door always firmly shut, with an old-fashioned keyhole that tempted my curiosity. One evening, when Mrs. Hargrove had gone to bed early, I found myself standing outside room 9, staring at the door. There was something about it that felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every time I passed that door I felt a chill, like a cold draft was seeping through the cracks. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the door, half expecting to hear something, a faint creak, a whisper, anything. But there was only silence. I looked around, making sure I was alone, and then I did something I knew I shouldn't. I crouched down and peered through the keyhole. At first, all I saw was darkness, like the room had been sealed in shadows. But as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the vague outline of a bed covered in a tattered, faded quilt. There was an old dresser against the wall, its mirror cracked and foggy, and a single window with the curtains drawn tight. The room looked abandoned, untouched by time. But then I saw her. In the corner near the window stood a woman. She was turned away from me, her long, dark hair cascading down her back. She was wearing a white dress that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and she was perfectly still like a statue. I blinked, my heart pounding, but she didn't move. She just stood there, facing the window, her presence both eerie and unsettling. I pulled back, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't believe what I'd seen. Was she a guest? A ghost? I didn't know, but I felt a rush of fear and excitement. I wanted to tell Mrs. Hargrove, to ask her about the woman in room 9, but something stopped me. I wasn't supposed to be looking in that room, and I didn't want to get fired. The next few days I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. Every time I passed room 9, I felt her presence, like she was waiting just on the other side of the door. I couldn't resist. I kept going back, peering through the keyhole, and every time she was there, always in the same spot, always facing the window. One night my curiosity got the better of me. I decided I had to know more. I waited until the inn was quiet, until Mrs. Hargrove had gone to bed, and then I made my way to room 9. I brought a flashlight, my heart racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. I stood outside the door, hesitating for a moment before crouching down to look through the keyhole again. But this time, all I saw was red. The keyhole was completely obscured, like someone had covered it from the inside. A chill ran down my spine. I stood up, shining the flashlight at the door, and that's when I noticed it. The faint outline of fingerprints smeared in red around the keyhole. Blood. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, my mind reeling. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty inn, and banged on Mrs. Hargrove's door. She answered, looking irritated and half asleep. "What is it?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she saw the panic on my face. There's someone in room 9, I stammered. "A woman. I saw her through the keyhole, but now there's blood." Mrs. Hargrove's expression changed instantly, her face going pale. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age, and pulled me into her room. She shut the door behind us, her hands trembling. "You looked through the keyhole?" she asked, her voice low and tense. I nodded, confused and scared. Mrs. Hargrove let out a shaky breath, running a hand through her gray hair. "I told you never to go near that room," she said, her voice breaking. You have no idea what you've done." I tried to explain, to apologize, but she cut me off, her eyes full of fear. She told me the story then, about her daughter, Eleanor. Eleanor had been beautiful, charming, but troubled. She had moved into room 9 after a fight with her fiancé, locking herself away from the world. Mrs. Hargrove hadn't seen her for days, and when she finally unlocked the door, she found Eleanor dead, her wrists slashed, her blood soaking into the faded quilt. Ever since then, the room had been sealed. Mrs. Hargrove had tried to keep it locked, to keep her daughter's spirit at peace, but something had changed when I looked through that keyhole. "She doesn't like to be watched," Mrs. Hargrove whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "She covers the keyhole with her eye. All you saw was her eye, red and angry." I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. I thought back to what I'd seen, the red blocking the keyhole, not blood, but an eye staring back at me. Mrs. Hargrove begged me to leave the inn, to never come back. She said Eleanor's spirit was restless now, disturbed by my intrusion. I packed my things that night, my hands shaking, and left without looking back. To this day, I can't get the image out of my mind. That red, staring eye filled with a rage I'll never understand. I've moved far away, started a new job, and tried to forget about the Riverside Inn. But sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. And when I close my eyes, all I can see is red. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a weekend getaway from the stress of city life, just me, my best friend Jake, and miles of untouched wilderness. We had planned it for weeks, poring over maps and guides, eager to lose ourselves in nature. We chose a trail deep in the mountains, one that promised breathtaking views and the kind of solitude you can only find miles away from civilization. The first day was perfect. The weather was clear, the air crisp, and the trail well marked. We followed the path through dense forests, over rocky outcroppings, and along the edge of a sparkling river. By the time we set up camp for the night, we were exhausted but happy, the stresses of our daily lives already fading into the background. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Jake pulled out a worn, old map he'd found at a thrift store. A collector's item, he'd called it. It was a hand-drawn map of the area, full of details and landmarks that didn't appear on our modern digital maps. As we looked it over, Jake noticed something strange, a narrow, winding trail branching off from our planned route. It wasn't marked on any of our other maps, and there was no mention of it in the guidebooks. "What do you think?" Jake asked, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Want to check it out tomorrow?" I hesitated. We had planned our route carefully, and this mysterious trail wasn't part of it. But Jake was always the adventurous one, the one who couldn't resist a good mystery. Eventually I agreed, figuring it would be a fun detour before we returned to the main trail. The next morning we packed up camp and set off in search of the forgotten path. It didn't take long to find it, hidden behind a cluster of tall pines, almost as if it was meant to be concealed. The trail was overgrown, barely more than a narrow strip of dirt winding through the trees. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Jake was thrilled. "This is going to be awesome," he said, leading the way with a spring in his step. At first, the trail was easy enough to follow, but as we went deeper into the forest, it became more difficult to navigate. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches blocking out the sunlight. The air grew cooler, the forest floor soft and spongy beneath our boots. The farther we went, the more the world seemed to close in around us. After an hour or so, we realized we were no longer on the trail. The path had faded into the underbrush, and we were surrounded by an unbroken wall of trees. We should have turned back then, but Jake was determined to press on. He was sure we could find our way back to the main trail if we just kept going a little farther. But the forest had other plans. The deeper we went, the more disoriented we became. The trees seemed to shift when we weren't looking, the undergrowth swallowing up any sign of the trail. The sky, once clear and blue, was now hidden by a thick canopy of leaves. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and I felt an uneasy pressure building in my chest. "Jake, we should head back," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "We're getting lost." but Jake just waved me off. "We're fine," he insisted, though there was a tightness in his voice that made me think he wasn't as confident as he was trying to appear. As we continued on, I started noticing strange things. The trees were all wrong, twisted and gnarled, their bark peeling away in long, papery strips. There was no sound, no birds or insects, just an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. And then there were the shapes, dark, indistinct figures that seemed to flit between the trees, always just out of sight. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw Jake stop dead in his tracks, staring off into the distance. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his eyes wide. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I had seen. A shadow, a flicker of movement, something that didn't belong in this world. We should have turned back then, we should have run. But instead, we kept going, drawn deeper into the forest by some unseen force. The trail had long since disappeared, and now we were wandering blindly, trying to find our way back. As the sun began to set, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening, the air growing colder. We were completely lost, and I could feel panic starting to set in. Jake was silent now, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by a tense, fearful expression. "We have to find shelter for the night," I said, trying to stay calm. "We'll regroup in the morning and find our way out." Jake nodded, though he didn't say anything. We stumbled through the underbrush, searching for a clearing, a cave, anything that might offer some protection. Finally, we found a small hollow beneath the roots of an enormous tree. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. We huddled together in the dark, our backs against the cold, damp earth, and tried to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come. The forest was alive with whispers, soft, eerie voices that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath us. I could hear them, just on the edge of my awareness, but I couldn't understand the words. Jake was trembling beside me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt something cold brush against my skin, like a hand, but not quite. I jerked away, my heart pounding, and looked around, but there was nothing there, just darkness and shadows. We spent the rest of the night in terrified silence, neither of us daring to move or speak. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we scrambled to our feet and began to run, desperate to escape the cursed forest. But no matter which direction we went, we couldn't find our way out. The trees seemed to close in around us, the underbrush growing thicker, the ground more treacherous. The whispers followed us, always just behind, always just out of sight. By midday we were exhausted, our legs shaking, our lungs burning. We stopped to catch our breath, leaning against a tree for support. That's when we saw it, a figure standing among the trees watching us. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was tall and thin, her skin as pale as the moon, her eyes dark and hollow. She was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, her hair hanging in limp, tangled strands. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at us with those empty, soulless eyes. Jake was the first to break. He let out a choked cry and took off running, crashing through the underbrush like a wild animal. I hesitated for a moment, frozen by fear, but then I followed, my heart racing. We ran for what felt like hours, but no matter how far we went, I could still feel her presence, still hear those whispers. They were in my head now, crawling through my mind like insects, filling me with a terror I couldn't shake. Finally, we broke through the trees and found ourselves back on the trail, the main trail, the one we had started on. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Jake was gone. I called out his name, my voice echoing through the forest, but there was no answer. I searched for hours, retracing my steps, but he had vanished, as if he had never been there at all. I couldn't find any trace of him, not even a footprint. Exhausted and terrified, I stumbled back to our campsite and collapsed, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What had happened? Where had Jake gone? And who was that woman in the forest? The next morning, I hiked back to the trailhead, my heart heavy with dread. I reported Jake's disappearance to the authorities, but they found nothing. No sign of him, no evidence that he had ever been on the trail. As I was leaving, one of the rangers pulled me aside. He was an older man with weathered skin and sharp eyes, and he looked at me with a seriousness that made my blood run cold. "Years ago," he said quietly, "there was a woman who lived in these woods. She was a hermit, a recluse. People said she was a witch, that she dabbled in dark magic. One day she vanished, just like your friend. No one ever found her, but sometimes people say they see her in the forest, wandering the old paths." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "And Jake?" The ranger shook his head. "Sometimes the forest takes people. Sometimes they come back, but not always the same." I left the mountains that day, and I've never gone back. But I still think about Jake, about the forgotten path we took, and about the whispers in the dark. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear them again, those soft, eerie voices calling to me from the shadows. And I know deep down that Jake is still out there somewhere, but he's not alone. I've always been a night owl. Something about the quiet hours of the night, when the world is asleep and everything is still, brings me a strange sense of peace. But tonight is different. Tonight, the stillness isn't comforting. It's suffocating. I'm sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone aimlessly. The digital clock on the wall reads 2:47 a.m. A familiar creak echoes through the house, and I freeze. It's the floorboard in the hallway, the one that only groans under pressure. No one else is home. I dismiss it. Old houses make noises, right? I turn my attention back to my phone, but my mind is racing. I can't shake the feeling that something is off. The air feels heavy, and the darkness seems to cling to the walls as if it's alive. I feel like I'm being watched. I glance up at the hallway, expecting to see nothing but shadows. Instead, I catch a glimpse of something, a figure standing at the end of the hall. It's tall, unnaturally tall, and impossibly thin. My breath catches in my throat. My eyes strain to make sense of the shape, but the darkness swallows it whole, leaving only a faint outline. I blink and it's gone. I try to rationalize it. It's just my imagination. Lack of sleep is making me see things. I laugh nervously, but it feels forced. I get up and walk to the kitchen, trying to shake the unease that's gnawing at me. I pour myself a glass of water, my hands trembling slightly. As I take a sip, I hear it again. That creak. Louder this time, closer. I whip around, water spilling onto the floor. My heart is pounding. There's no one there, but the feeling of being watched is stronger now, pressing down on me like a weight. I grab a knife from the counter, my grip tight. I know it's ridiculous, but it makes me feel a little safer. I edge toward the hallway, the knife raised. The house is silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then I hear a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It's coming from the hallway, from the darkness. It's a voice I don't recognize, but it feels familiar, like a long-forgotten memory. "Help me," it says. The words are barely a breath, but they send a chill down my spine. I want to run, but my legs won't move. I feel rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The whisper comes again, more urgent this time. "Help me, please." Against my better judgment, I step into the hallway. The shadows seem to stretch and shift, swallowing the light. I can't see anything, but I can feel it. The presence, the eyes boring into me. The air is thick, almost tangible, and I struggle to breathe. Then I see it. The figure is back, closer now. I can make out more details. Its skin is pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, empty, hollow voids that seem to suck in all the light around them. It's not human. It's something else. Something wrong. It reaches out, a skeletal hand extending towards me. I stumble back, dropping the knife. My heart is racing. my mind screaming at me to run, but I'm frozen. The figure steps closer and I can see its face now. It's twisted, deformed like a reflection in a shattered mirror. And then I realize it's wearing my face. I'm staring at a distorted version of myself, a hollow, empty shell. Its mouth opens, but the words don't match the movement. It's like a badly dubbed video, out of sync and wrong. "You shouldn't be here," it says, but the voice is mine. It's like listening to a recording of myself, but twisted, corrupted. I want to scream, but no sound comes out. The figure steps closer still, its hand brushing against my arm. It's cold, impossibly cold, and I feel a jolt of pain. My vision blurs, and I'm suddenly overwhelmed by memories. My memories. Flashes of my childhood, my fears, my regrets. They flood my mind, drowning me in a tidal wave of emotion. I gasp, and the figure pulls back, its hollow eyes watching me intently. And then it speaks again, and this time, I understand. "I'm what you left behind," it says, and the realization hits me like a punch to the gut. This thing, this hollow version of myself, is everything I've tried to forget, everything I've buried deep inside. My mistakes, my guilt, my darkest thoughts. I back away, tears streaming down my face. The figure doesn't follow. It just stands there, watching, as if it's waiting for something. I turn and run, stumbling through the darkness, desperate to escape. I don't stop until I'm outside, gasping for air. The night is cold, the wind biting at my skin, but I don't care. I keep running, away from the house, away from that thing. I don't look back. But as I reach the end of the street, I hear it one last time, a whisper carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable. "You can't run from yourself." I don't sleep that night. I don't think I'll ever sleep again, because I know now that it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it's still out there, waiting. And the worst part? Deep down, I know it's right. No matter how far I run, I can't escape what I've become. Because the Hollow One isn't just a monster, it's me. I'll never forget the night I discovered the room that wasn't there. It's still hard to believe it even happened, but every detail of that night is etched into my mind as clear as day. My name is Daniel, and this is my story. It all started when I moved into an old apartment building on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't ask too many questions. I just needed a place to crash while I got my life back together. The building was ancient, the kind with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to whisper secrets in the dead of night. On my first night there, I noticed something odd. The hallway outside my apartment was longer than it looked from the inside. Standing in the hallway, I could swear there was enough space for an extra room next to mine, but from inside, my apartment's wall lined up perfectly with my neighbor's. I brushed it off as a trick of the eye, but the thought kept nagging at me. A week went by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, as I was leaving for work, I noticed a small crack in the wall where I'd never seen one before, right where I'd imagined that missing room. It was faint, but it was there. I ran my hand over it, and the paint flaked off like old skin. I decided that after work, I'd take a closer look. Maybe it was just bad maintenance, but my curiosity was piqued. That night I got home around midnight. The building was quiet, eerily so. I grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver and headed out into the hallway. The crack in the wall seemed to have widened since earlier. I hesitated, a chill creeping up my spine, but I pressed on. I chipped away at the wall piece by piece until there was a hole big enough to peer through. I shined my flashlight inside and felt my blood run cold. It was a room, all right. A room that wasn't supposed to be there. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Dust blanketed every surface, and old furniture was strewn about as if someone had left in a hurry. But that wasn't the worst part. In the corner of the room was a figure, crouched and unmoving. It was too dark to make out details, but it was unmistakably human-shaped. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that whoever, or whatever it was, it hadn't moved since I started looking. I told myself it was a mannequin or a pile of clothes, something innocuous. I had to get a better look. I widened the hole and squeezed through. The air inside was musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, and with every step I felt like I was trespassing into something I shouldn't. The figure was still in the corner, shrouded in shadow. As I approached, my flashlight flickered and died. Panic set in, and I scrambled to get my phone out, using the weak glow of the screen to navigate. I inched closer until I was right next to the figure. My hand trembled as I reached out, barely grazing what felt like cold, brittle fabric. Suddenly, the room's temperature plummeted. I felt breath on my neck, and then a voice, soft, whispering. "Why did you come here?" I spun around, but no one was there. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the figure, tripping over debris and crashing into the wall. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into complete darkness. I clawed at the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. I could still feel that cold breath on my neck, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Just when I thought I'd lose my mind, the door flew open and I stumbled into the hallway. I turned back, expecting to see the room again, but all that was there was a solid wall, the crack completely gone as if it had never been there. I bolted back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and I moved out the next day. I asked the landlord about the room, but he just gave me a strange look and said there was no such room in the building. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still feel that cold breath on my neck and hear those whispers, reminding me of the room that wasn't there, and the thing that never left. There's a saying that photographs capture a piece of your soul. I never believed it, just another superstition, right? But now, every time I look at a picture, I can't help but wonder what else might be lurking in the frame. It all started when I moved into a new apartment, a small, cozy place in a quiet part of town. The previous tenant had left behind some old furniture and knickknacks, which suited me just fine since I didn't own much. As I was unpacking, I found an old Polaroid camera tucked away in a dusty box in the closet. It was one of those vintage ones, bulky and clunky, with a faded leather strap and a few leftover instant film packs. I decided to keep it, thinking it might be fun to take some retro-style photos. I snapped a few shots around the apartment. Nothing fancy, just test shots of my furniture, the view from my window, and the old ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. I shook each photo as it developed, watching the ghostly images slowly come to life. That's when I noticed something strange. In the first photo, the one of my living room, there was a faint outline near the window, like a smudge or a shadow that I hadn't noticed before. I squinted at it, convinced it was just a trick of the light. I shrugged it off and moved on to the next picture. But there it was again, that same vague figure, now closer to the center of the room. I felt a flicker of unease but brushed it aside. Old cameras have their quirks, I told myself. It was probably just a flaw in the film or a reflection I hadn't noticed. But as I took more photos, the shadow kept appearing. Each time it was closer, more distinct. A tall, thin silhouette, its features blurred but unmistakably human. By the fifth photo, it was standing right in the middle of the room, facing the camera. I stared at it, a cold knot forming in my stomach. It was as if the figure was moving closer with every shot, inching its way toward me, frame by frame. I flipped through the photos, my heart pounding, the images growing more unsettling with each look. The last one sent chills through me. It was a photo of the hallway mirror, taken just minutes before. The figure was no longer in the background. Instead, it was staring back at me from the reflection, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes, dark, hollow eyes, seemed to bore straight into mine. I dropped the photo, my hands shaking. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the apartment was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I quickly packed the camera away, shoving it back into the closet and slamming the door. It was just an old camera with some messed up film, I tried to convince myself. Nothing more. But that night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside felt amplified, like someone was moving through the apartment. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the dark hallway, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe for the figure to step out of the photographs and into my world. The next morning, I resolved to get rid of the camera. I packed it in a box with the photos, taped it shut, and stuffed it in the bottom of my closet. Out of sight, out of mind. I spent the day trying to forget about the whole thing, but every time I passed the mirror in the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Then late that night I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the closet. It was subtle at first, like fingers drumming lightly against wood. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the apartment. I stared at the closet door, dread pooling in my stomach. It was just the building settling, I told myself. Or maybe an animal trapped in the walls. Anything but what I feared it might be. I crept closer, every instinct screaming at me to run. The tapping stopped as I reached for the handle, replaced by a heavy silence that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. I yanked the door open, half expecting the camera to be gone. The box opened and the photos scattered. But it was just as I'd left it, the box sealed, untouched. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief and closed the door, backing away. But as I turned, something caught my eye. A faint smudge on the mirror, a dark spot that hadn't been there before. I approached it slowly, dread clawing at my throat. The smudge grew clearer, taking shape as I got closer. It was a handprint, long and thin, pressed against the glass from the inside. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I grabbed my phone, snapping a quick picture of the mirror in a panic. I checked the photo, my breath hitching in my throat. There it was, clear as day. The same figure from the Polaroids, now fully formed, standing just behind my reflection, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I didn't stay to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. I never went back, not even to collect my things. I couldn't bring myself to face whatever had been in those photos, whatever had found its way into my home. I've moved twice since then, always careful to choose places with no old mirrors, no strange noises, and definitely no forgotten cameras. But sometimes, in the quiet of night, I still hear that faint tapping, like knuckles on glass, just on the edge of hearing. And every time I see my reflection, I look just a little bit longer, just to be sure that I'm alone. Because now I know, some things can't be captured by film, and some shadows are more than just tricks of the light. I've always loved camping in the woods. There's something calming about the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, the crackling of a campfire, and the feeling of being miles away from civilization. I'm not one to be scared easily. I've camped in all sorts of remote places far from any other human presence, but one trip last summer changed all of that, and now I'm not sure I'll ever camp alone again. It was late July, and I decided to spend a weekend camping in a national forest a few hours from my home. I'd heard about a spot called Hollow Campground, a remote site tucked deep in the woods, rarely visited even during peak season. It wasn't on any of the official maps, but I'd found directions in an old hiking forum online. It sounded perfect, quiet, secluded, and exactly what I needed to escape the stress of work. I packed my gear and set out early in the morning, following the winding roads into the forest. It took me a while to find the narrow, unmarked dirt path that led to the campground, but eventually I arrived. Hollow Campground was exactly as described, empty and overgrown, with a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The only sound was the occasional chirp of a bird and the soft rustle of the wind. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close to a small, stagnant pond that reflected the dark canopy above. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was an odd stillness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath, but I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the isolation. I spent the afternoon exploring the area, hiking the overgrown trails and snapping photos of the old gnarled trees that looked like they'd been there for centuries. As the sun began to set, I returned to my campsite and lit a fire. I cooked a simple meal, sat back in my camping chair, and watched the flames dance in the growing darkness. The night was clear, the sky dotted with stars, and for the first time in a while I felt completely at peace. But then, as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere in the woods. It was soft, barely audible, like someone tapping a stick against a tree. I paused, listening, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I brushed it off as a woodpecker or some other harmless forest noise and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. I must have drifted off for a few hours, but I woke up to the sound of tapping again, louder this time. It was steady, almost like a heartbeat, and it seemed to be coming from just beyond the clearing. I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The tapping stopped, and I couldn't see anything unusual, just the tall trees looming like silent sentinels in the dark. I sat there for a while, listening, but the sound didn't return. Feeling uneasy, I zipped up the tent and lay back down, telling myself it was nothing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard soft footsteps, or the faint rustling of leaves, like something was moving around my campsite. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the tapping louder, closer, and this time accompanied by a low, whispering sound. I shot up, heart racing, and grabbed my flashlight. The tent felt suffocating, and I quickly unzipped it, stumbling out into the cool night air. The tapping was incessant now, coming from all directions, echoing through the trees. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the forest, but the beam cut through nothing but empty darkness. The whispering was growing louder, a soft, breathy chant that seemed to come from the very ground beneath my feet. It was like a chorus of voices, layered and indistinct, all speaking at once in a language I didn't recognize. Panic set in. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but something was wrong, deeply wrong. I grabbed my knife from the tent, holding it out in front of me, as if it would do any good against whatever was out there. I backed towards the campfire, desperately trying to see what was making the noise. The flames flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and warped with the movement of the trees. Then I saw them. Figures, just beyond the tree line. They were tall and thin, almost impossibly so, with elongated limbs and faces that were obscured by darkness. They stood completely still, like statues, just watching. My flashlight beam wavered as I tried to focus on them, but every time I blinked, they seemed to move closer, just a fraction, barely noticeable. I shouted out, demanding to know who they were, but my voice felt swallowed by the thick air. The whispering continued, growing louder, more urgent, and the figures took another step closer. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a rock, and I fell hard, the flashlight skittering across the ground. In the brief moment before it went out, I saw their faces, pale, featureless, with dark hollow indentations where eyes should have been. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight and knife, and ran. I didn't care where I was going, just away from those things, those impossible creatures. The tapping and whispering followed me, a relentless, inescapable noise that filled my head and drowned out all rational thought. I tripped over roots, tore through branches, and ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Somehow I found my way back to the main road, gasping and drenched in sweat. I kept running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the deserted road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, safe under the harsh glow of streetlights. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing, replaying the sounds, the shapes, the hollow faces that I couldn't forget. I never went back for my tent or gear. I didn't care. I just wanted to forget Hollow Campground ever existed. I tried to find out more about the place afterward, but there was nothing. No mentions on any official park maps, no records, nothing. It was like the campground had been erased, forgotten by time. The old hiking forum where I'd found the directions had disappeared too, replaced by a 404 not found message as if it had never been there at all. Now, whenever I think about camping, I remember those hollow faces and the relentless tapping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I haven't been able to set foot in the woods since. The quiet that I once found so soothing now feels oppressive, and I can't help but feel like something is watching, just beyond the trees, waiting. And sometimes in the dead of night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it again. That faint, rhythmic tapping echoing from somewhere far off. And I wonder if whatever was in those woods isn't done with me yet. I've been a truck driver for nearly 15 years. Long hauls, late nights, and miles of empty highway are my bread and butter. I've seen just about everything out there. Crazy drivers, wild animals, bizarre weather, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered one cold, foggy night on Route 66. It was around midnight, and I was making my way through the Arizona desert, hauling a load of electronics to California. The highway was deserted, a ribbon of asphalt stretching endlessly into the darkness. I'd been on the road for hours, and fatigue was starting to set in. My eyelids were heavy, and I kept slapping myself to stay awake, occasionally cranking up the radio just to break the monotony. The fog started rolling in around 1 a.m. At first, it was just a light mist, but soon it thickened into a dense white wall that swallowed everything beyond the reach of my headlights. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I slowed down, squinting at the road ahead, trying to keep my rig from drifting off the pavement. I've driven through fog before, but this was different. It wasn't just thick, it was cold, unnaturally so, and it seemed to cling to the truck like it was alive, wrapping around the cab and muffling the sound of the engine. It felt like I was driving through a cloud of ice, and the temperature gauge on my dash plummeted even though it was the middle of the desert. I kept going, my hands clenched tight around the wheel, eyes straining to see through the fog. That's when I saw the figure on the side of the road. At first, it was just a vague shape, a shadow barely visible in the thick mist. But as I got closer, I could make out the details. A man standing on the shoulder, dressed in old, ragged clothes, waving one arm slowly as if trying to flag me down. Instinctively, I slowed the truck to a crawl, but something didn't feel right. There was something off about the way he moved, something unnatural. His motions were stiff and jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and I couldn't see his face. Just a mess of dark, matted hair and pale skin that looked almost translucent in the headlights. I pulled to the side, stopping a few feet away. Normally, I wouldn't hesitate to help someone stranded on the road, especially in the middle of nowhere. But something about this guy set off every alarm in my head. Still, I rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, you okay? Need a lift?" He didn't answer, just stood there staring at me with those empty, dark eyes that seemed to swallow the light. I felt a chill run down my spine. The air inside the cab was freezing now, my breath fogging up the windshield. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get out of there fast. The man took a step closer, his movement slow and deliberate, and I noticed something else. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was hovering, just an inch or two above the pavement, gliding silently toward the truck. My heart pounded in my chest, and I threw the truck into gear, my instincts screaming at me to get away. As I started to pull back onto the road, the man reached out, slapping his hand against the side of the truck. The impact shook the cab, and the whole rig shuddered like I'd hit a pothole. I glanced in the side mirror, and for a split second I saw his face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that were too big, too dark, and a mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. I floored it, the tires spinning on the wet asphalt before catching and launching the truck forward. My heart raced as I sped down the highway, the fog thickening around me. The radio crackled with static, and every light on the dash flickered as if the truck was struggling to stay running. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see the man following, but there was nothing. Just the thick, swirling fog that seemed to stretch on forever. After what felt like an eternity, the fog started to thin and the temperature inside the cab slowly returned to normal. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my grip on the wheel loosening just a bit. I pulled into a rest stop a few miles down the road, my hands still shaking as I climbed out of the cab. I checked the side of the truck where the man had touched it, half expecting to see a dent or some kind of mark, but there was nothing. Just the same worn paint and dust as before. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lights on in the cab, my eyes glued to the fog outside, half expecting to see that figure materialize out of the mist. Eventually, the sun came up, burning away the fog and leaving nothing but clear blue skies and empty highway. I finished my delivery and tried to put the whole thing behind me, but a few days later, I heard something on the trucker's radio chatter that made my blood run cold. Another driver had seen the same figure on Route 66, right around the same stretch of road. He described the man exactly: ragged clothes, hovering off the ground, that eerie, too-wide grin. I started asking around, talking to other truckers who ran the same routes, and the stories started to pile up. Drivers would see the figure on foggy nights, always in the same spot, always waving them down. Some had stopped to help, but no one ever picked him up. One guy swore he saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, forcing him to swerve off and nearly jackknife his rig. Another claimed he felt cold hands brush against him as he drove past, even though his windows were closed. I dug deeper, looking into the history of that stretch of road, and found an old article buried in a local archive. Back in the 1950s, a trucker had died on Route 66 in a fog-related accident. His rig had gone off the road and down a steep embankment, killing him instantly. They said he was found half out of the cab, his face twisted in a horrible expression, almost like he was screaming. The kicker: his body had been found hovering just above the ground, suspended in midair as if he'd been caught between worlds. The article was brief, and there was no follow-up, just a mention that the area was known for dangerous fog and poor visibility. I stopped driving that route after that. Call it superstition, call it fear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night was more than just a ghost story. I don't know what it wants or why it's still there, but every time I hear about another sighting, I wonder if it's looking for something, or someone. And sometimes when I'm driving late at night and the fog starts to roll in, I catch myself glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see that figure standing in the mist, waiting for his next ride. Because once you've seen the highway phantom, you don't forget. You just keep driving, hoping he doesn't catch up. I've always been drawn to the wilderness. There's something about the vastness, the quiet, the sense of being utterly alone with nature that feels like a reset button for my mind. That's why every year I make it a point to take a solo camping trip. Just me, my tent, and the untouched beauty of the great outdoors. This year I decided to venture out to Blackwater Canyon National Park, a lesser-known spot with a reputation for its untouched beauty and remote trails. It was a sprawling park, filled with dense forests, steep cliffs, and winding rivers that cut through the landscape like veins. The rangers I spoke to were friendly enough, but they warned me, stick to the marked trails, don't wander off. There's a lot of ground out there and not all of it safe. I figured they were just being overly cautious. After all, I'd been hiking and camping in remote places for years. So, Armed with a map, a backpack full of supplies, and my trusty camera, I set off early one morning, eager to explore the hidden corners of Blackwater Canyon. The first day was everything I hoped it would be. The weather was perfect, the trails were rugged and challenging, and the views were breathtaking. I pitched my tent near a small, clear stream, cooked a simple meal over a campfire, and settled in for the night under a blanket of stars. It was perfect, too perfect almost. It was on the second day that things started to feel off. I had planned a longer hike, hoping to reach a secluded waterfall that I'd heard about from one of the rangers. It wasn't on any official map, but he said if I was willing to stray off the main trail for a bit, I'd find it. That should have been my first red flag. I veered off the marked path around noon, following what I thought was a faint trail through the underbrush. But after a while, the path disappeared altogether, and I found myself surrounded by dense trees and thick undergrowth. I should have turned back, but the idea of finding something hidden, something not many others had seen, kept me going. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The air grew thick and oppressive, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I noticed things, odd shapes carved into the bark of the trees, small piles of rocks that looked like they'd been deliberately arranged. And then there were the sounds, not the usual forest noises of birds or rustling leaves, but low, distant hums, like a deep, vibrating echo that I could feel in my bones. Around mid-afternoon, I realized I was lost. The landscape had become unfamiliar, every tree and boulder looking the same, and no matter which direction I turned, the path I thought I was following had vanished. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was like the forest was shifting around me, twisting the paths in impossible ways. As the sun dipped lower, a thick fog began to roll in, seeping between the trees and clinging to the ground. It was unlike any fog I'd seen before, heavy and dark, almost black, like smoke from a fire. It obscured everything beyond a few feet, and I felt my anxiety spike. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I'd camp for the night and find my way back in the morning. I set up my tent quickly, fumbling with the poles in the growing darkness. The fog seemed to swallow the light, making everything feel muted and distant. I ate a quick meal, my appetite gone, and crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled in my gut. It was quiet, too quiet. I strained my ears, expecting to hear the normal night sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustling of small animals. But there was nothing. Just a heavy, oppressive silence that felt like it was pressing down on me. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept thinking about the fog, about how it didn't feel right, how it seemed to move with a purpose. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there I realized it was voices, low, murmuring voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. They were close, too close, like they were right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fog was thicker now, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns. And in the fog I saw them, shadows, moving slowly, gliding just above the ground. They were tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. They moved in a slow, rhythmic pattern, almost like they were dancing, but the way they swayed and bent was wrong, like broken marionettes. I pulled back, closing the tent flap as quietly as I could, my mind racing. I knew I should have done something, grabbed my flashlight, my knife, anything. But I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear that felt primal, instinctive. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. But it was inside my head, a chorus of low, echoing voices that seemed to be speaking directly to me. "Come with us. Come see." I don't know how long I lay there, listening to the whispers, but eventually I must have drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke, the fog was gone, and the morning light filtered weakly through the trees. The forest seemed normal again, but I felt off, like I was out of sync with the world around me. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking, and set off in what I hoped was the right direction. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The forest was silent again, just like the night before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow darting between the trees, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By midday, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a large, stagnant pond, its surface covered in a thick layer of black scum. The water was still, too still, and as I approached, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to look into it. I leaned over the edge, staring down at my reflection in the murky water. And then I saw them, just beneath the surface, faces pale and distorted, with wide, unblinking eyes and mouths stretched open in silent screams. They stared up at me, their expressions frozen in a mix of fear and despair. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled back, falling onto the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I realized the faces were gone. The pond was empty, just dark water and that foul scum. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew those faces were real. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I was going, just desperate to get away. Hours later, I finally found a marked trail and followed it back to the main campground. I must have looked like a mess because when I stumbled into the ranger station, they immediately called an ambulance. I didn't have the energy to explain what had happened. I just kept repeating, "There's something out there." The rangers tried to reassure me, saying the park was safe, that no one else had reported anything unusual. They chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe dehydration, and told me to rest. But I knew the truth. I'd seen those shadows, heard those whispers, and looked into the eyes of whatever was lurking in that fog. I haven't been back to the woods since. I've tried to forget, to convince myself that it was all some hallucination, a bad dream brought on by isolation and fear. But every night when I close my eyes, I still hear those voices echoing in the back of my mind, calling me back to Blackwater Canyon. And sometimes, just before I drift off to sleep, I feel a cold breath on my neck and the faintest whisper in my ear, promising that one day I'll return. Because the forest doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. And once you've seen the echoes of Blackwater Canyon, they never truly let you go. I just wrapped up my last shift at the old Hawkins building, and let me tell you, what happened tonight is going to chill you to the bone. Before we dive into this, make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell icon. This is a story you won't want to miss. It was supposed to be an ordinary shift. I was Alex, a security guard at the Hawkins building, a long abandoned office complex with a reputation for being haunted. But tonight wasn't just another shift. I had been told this would be my last night working there, and the place seemed more unsettling than ever. As I walked through the dimly lit lobby, the silence was deafening. The only sounds were the creaks of the old building and the occasional hum of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. My first task was to make my rounds, check the cameras, make sure the alarms were functional, and patrol the floors. On the third floor, something unusual caught my eye, a door that was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it earlier. The sign on the door read, "Utility Room," a space usually filled with old dusty equipment. I pushed the door open, and the smell of mildew hit me. I glanced around, but the room was empty, except for a few broken chairs and a rusty filing cabinet. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for a single fresh set of footprints in the dust. That's when I started feeling it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a shiver ran down my spine. I had been working at Hawkins for months and had always dismissed the ghost stories as urban legends. But tonight, something felt different. I continued my patrol, trying to shake the eerie feeling that was settling in. The office floors were just as empty and silent as usual. But as I reached the 10th floor, something strange happened. The security monitors, which had been showing a blank feed for the past few hours, suddenly flickered to life. The screens displayed static, but for a split second, I saw a shadow move in the corner of the frame. My heart raced as I scrambled to check the cameras in the area. There was nothing there, just the empty hallways. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I decided to investigate the source of the shadow, heading toward the maintenance room, which was known to be a hot spot for strange occurrences. When I arrived, I noticed that the door was slightly open, much like the utility room door from earlier. I pushed it open, and the room was bathed in an eerie glow from a single flickering light bulb. The room was cluttered with old tools and broken equipment. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Then I saw it, a small old-fashioned tape recorder sitting on a workbench. Next to it was a note that read, "For the next guard." Curiosity got the better of me, so I pressed play. The tape hissed to life, and a distorted voice began to speak. "If you're hearing this, you're about to learn the truth. The Hawkins building has a dark secret. The previous guards knew too much and did not leave." My heart pounded as I listened. The tape continued, detailing how the building had been built on cursed land, and how the spirits of those who had been wronged sought revenge. It mentioned something about a guardian spirit that ensured no one left after discovering the truth. The tape ended abruptly with a chilling, ghostly wail. I immediately started to feel a presence. I turned around and saw the door slam shut on its own. The lights flickered and then went out completely. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, it only illuminated a swirling mass of shadows in the corners of the room. In sheer panic, I ran for the exit, but the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly. My breaths were ragged, and every door I tried was locked. I felt as if the building itself was closing in on me. Finally, I reached the stairwell, but as I descended, the steps seemed to stretch endlessly downward. Then I saw a figure at the bottom of the stairs. It was a guard, one I didn't recognize, but he was wearing the same uniform I had on. He looked up at me with a sad, resigned expression. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "There's no escape. Once you know the truth, you become part of the building." Before I could react, the figure dissolved into the shadows. I turned to run, but the stairs had vanished. I was left in complete darkness, my own panic echoing through the empty halls. The final thing I remember was the sound of my own name being whispered, and then everything went black. I woke up outside the building, lying in the grass. The sun was just coming up, and I could see the old Hawkins building in the distance. I've since been told that the building has been sealed off, and no one is allowed near it. The strange thing is, I saw a new security guard uniform hanging in my locker the next day, with a note attached, "For the next guard." I don't know if anyone will ever read this, but if you're listening, remember this. Some places are best left unexplored, and some truths are better left buried. It was another quiet night on the graveyard shift. I sat alone in the security office, sipping my coffee and watching the multiple camera feeds on the monitors. The old office building was completely empty, save for myself and the occasional nocturnal critter scurrying across the dark hallways. As the clock struck 2 a.m., I let out a yawn. Another uneventful night, or so I thought. Suddenly, one of the cameras in the east wing flickered and went dark. I sat up straight, my heart racing. I quickly checked the other feeds, but everything else seemed normal. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way down the dimly lit corridor towards the affected area. The farther I walked, the more unsettled I felt. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. I shone my light around, searching for any sign of what could have caused the camera to go out. As I rounded the corner, I froze. There, in the distance, was a tall, shadowy figure standing motionless in the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out who or what it was. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The figure did not respond. It simply stood there, staring back at me with unblinking, soulless eyes. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my palms sweating. Every instinct told me to turn and run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the unsettling presence. Mustering my courage, I took a step forward. "This is security. Identify yourself." Still, the figure remained silent, unmoving. I took another step, shining my light directly at it. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure had no discernible features. No face, no limbs, nothing. just a tall, dark silhouette. My heart pounded in my ears as I realized this was no ordinary intruder. This thing, whatever it was, didn't belong in the physical world. Panic seized me and I turned to flee, but as I spun around, the shadowy figure was suddenly there, blocking my path. I let out a terrified scream, stumbling backwards. The thing advanced towards me, its featureless face mere inches from mine. I could feel its cold, unnatural presence enveloping me, suffocating me. In a last-ditch effort, I swung my flashlight at the entity, but my hand passed right through it, as if it were made of smoke. The light flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain that this was the end. But then a faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance. I opened my eyes to see a small flickering flame dancing in the hallway, growing brighter with each passing second. The shadowy figure turned towards the light, letting out a bone-chilling screech that made my skin crawl. Then, to my astonishment, the entity began to slowly dissipate, as if the flame was driving it away. As the last traces of the dark presence vanished, the flame grew into a roaring fire, illuminating the hallway. I stood there, dumbfounded, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was then that I noticed a figure emerging from the flames, a woman, her eyes glowing with an unearthly power. She approached me, a serene expression on her face. "You're safe now," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "That creature won't be bothering you again." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I simply stared at her, utterly bewildered. "I am the guardian of this place," she continued. "It is my duty to protect it from the darkness that lurks in the shadows." With that, she turned and walked back into the flames, disappearing from sight. I was left alone in the hallway, my heart still pounding, my mind racing with questions. As I made my way back to the security office, I knew one thing for certain: I would never look at this building the same way again. I never thought my job as a night security guard would lead me down such a dark and terrifying path. But here I am, trapped in a waking nightmare, my heart pounding in my chest, as I try to make sense of the horrors I've witnessed. It all started a few weeks ago, when I was assigned to patrol the grounds of an old abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town. The job seemed straightforward enough. Keep an eye on things, make sure no one was up to any mischief, and report back to my supervisor in the morning. Little did I know the true terrors that lurked between the crumbling headstones. The first few nights were uneventful, save for the occasional stray cat or curious raccoon. I would make my rounds, shining my flashlight into the shadows, and then settle back into my little security booth, sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to stay awake. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice strange occurrences. Strange noises would echo through the cemetery, distant and otherworldly. The sound of rustling leaves, the crack of a twig, the faint whispers of voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I would whirl around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was never anything there. Just the eerie silence of the graveyard, broken only by the hooting of an owl or the scurrying of small creatures. One night, as I was making my rounds, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the tombstones. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon. But then I saw it again, a figure, tall and thin, gliding silently through the rows of graves. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure seemed to sense my presence, and it turned towards me, its face obscured by a tattered hood. I felt a chill run down my spine as it began to drift closer, its movements fluid and unnatural. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. As the figure drew closer, I caught a glimpse of its face, or what passed for a face. It was a twisted, inhuman visage, with sunken eyes and a gaping, toothless mouth. I let out a strangled cry and stumbled backwards, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. In the brief moment of illumination, I saw more of these creatures, emerging from the shadows, their skeletal frames and glowing eyes filling me with a primal terror. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, the sound of their unearthly wails chasing me through the cemetery. I don't know how I made it back to the security booth, but when I finally reached it, I slammed the door behind me and barricaded it with whatever I could find. I huddled in the corner, shaking uncontrollably as the sounds of the creatures outside grew louder and more frantic. And that's where I've been ever since, trapped in this nightmare, waiting for the sun to rise and praying that I'll make it out of here alive. I don't know what those things are or where they came from, but I know one thing for certain. The graveyard shift is no longer just a job, it's a fight for survival. It was a chilly October night, and I was working the midnight shift at an old abandoned hospital, one of those places where rumors and eerie legends swirl like fog. The new property developers wanted to assess it before demolishing it, and they hired me to patrol the building until morning. I didn't mind. The pay was good, and I had always enjoyed the quiet of the night. The hospital was a sprawling maze of corridors, long forgotten and crumbling. The walls were stained with the ghosts of its past, and the only light came from my flashlight and the sporadic flicker of dying overhead bulbs. The wind howled through the broken windows, adding an extra layer of unease to the atmosphere. My first few hours were uneventful. I went through my rounds, checking the security feeds and making sure the building was secure. I was used to the eerie silence, but it felt especially oppressive tonight. Around 2 a.m., I was in the basement, a place with an unsettling energy. It was cold and damp, with the walls covered in mildew. I was about to head back upstairs when I noticed a faint metallic smell in the air. I followed the scent and found a large old medical locker partially hidden behind some broken shelves. Curiosity got the best of me, so I pried it open. Inside, I discovered old medical records, faded and yellowed with age. But there was something else, a set of old keys on a chain labeled Surgical Suite. My heart skipped a beat. The surgical suite was the area where patients had undergone operations, and it was rumored to be the most haunted part of the hospital. I had no intention of visiting it, but the keys intrigued me. As I made my way to the surgical suite, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The feeling grew stronger as I approached the locked door with the old keys. The key turned in the lock with a groan, and I pushed the door open. The surgical suite was just as I had imagined, cold, sterile, and utterly forsaken. The room was filled with old, rusted medical instruments, and the operating table sat in the center, draped with a thin layer of dust. A large mirror on one wall reflected the empty, unsettling space. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was like someone was right behind me, breathing heavily. I turned around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, forming a coherent sentence. "Help us!" My flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with the switch, and when the light finally came back on, I noticed something chilling. The reflection in the mirror was different. There was a figure standing behind me, shrouded in darkness with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched in a silent scream. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew colder and the whispers became frantic. I stumbled backward and knocked over a tray of old surgical tools. The clatter echoed through the room, and the whispers turned into anguished cries. Panicking, I rushed to the door, but it was jammed. I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The cries grew louder, more desperate, and I could feel a presence closing in on me. My flashlight flickered again, and I saw the figure in the mirror move closer. It was reaching out, its hand stretching toward me. Suddenly, the door burst open, and I saw a man standing there in a security uniform, just like mine. His face was ashen, and his eyes were wide with terror. "You need to get out," he shouted. "They're coming for you." I didn't need any further encouragement. I shoved past him and ran down the hallways, the cries of the spirits echoing in my ears. I finally reached the exit and burst outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath. I turned back to look at the hospital, but the door was locked, and the building seemed to loom over me with a menacing presence. So here's the twist. When I reviewed the security footage the next day, I discovered something truly horrifying. There was no footage of the figure I saw, nor of the man who warned me. Instead, the cameras showed me walking into the surgical suite alone and then frantically trying to open the door. But the most disturbing part? The timestamp showed that the footage ended just before I saw the figure in the mirror. There was no one else there, or at least no one who should have been. The whispers, the figure, the man in the uniform. It was all part of the hospital's twisted history, trying to lure and trap its victims. I'm a security guard at Ashwood Manor, a crumbling estate nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest. The manor's gloomy presence looms over the town, its history marred by whispered tales of madness and tragedy. I took this job 3 months ago, hoping to save enough for college, but each night spent here has twisted my perception of reality. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I settled into my perch at the front desk, the flickering fluorescent lights casting an unsettling glow. The sound of the wind howling through the trees outside sent shivers down my spine. I was alone, or so I thought. The only sounds were the creaking of the floorboards and the distant rustle of leaves. It was my third shift alone, and I was beginning to notice the peculiarities of the manor. The air felt heavy, thick with an unsettling energy. Shadows danced in my peripheral vision, and I often caught the faint scent of something sweet, like rotten fruit, wafting through the halls. The unsettling atmosphere seeped into my bones, but I brushed it off as nerves. Around midnight, I began my rounds. The mansion had its quirks. The grand staircase spiraled up into darkness. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow me, and the whispers of the past echoed through the empty rooms. I made my way to the west wing, where the air felt colder. I had been warned about this part of the house. The locals called it the Forgotten Wing. They said it was haunted by the spirit of a woman named Eleanor, who had met a tragic end here decades ago. As I stepped into the dimly lit corridor, my flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on my mind. I heard a soft sobbing, almost like a lullaby, drifting from a nearby room. Curiosity clawed at me, pulling me toward the door. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, I found a dusty nursery, the walls adorned with faded murals of dancing fairies. A rocking chair swayed gently, though no one was in sight. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate. I scanned the room, heart pounding, and my gaze landed on a cracked mirror. Reflected in its surface was a fleeting glimpse of a pale figure, long hair, tattered dress, tears streaming down her face. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence that seemed to swallow the room whole. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through my veins as I rattled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then the figure appeared again, clearer this time. It was Eleanor, or what remained of her. Her eyes were hollow, filled with despair. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like a cold breeze. "He won't let me go." I felt an overwhelming urge to assist her, despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "Who?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. "The man in the mirror," she cried, pointing tremblingly. "He takes souls. I was his last victim. You need to run before he comes for you too." Suddenly the room darkened, the shadows coiling and twisting into a monstrous figure that emerged from the mirror. It was a grotesque version of a man, his face twisted in a malevolent grin, eyes glowing with malice. "You shouldn't have come here, Oliver," he hissed, his voice echoing like thunder. I turned back to Eleanor, but she was gone, leaving only a chilling silence in her wake. The door creaked open, and the hallway flooded with light. Without thinking, I bolted through the doorway, racing down the corridor, heart pounding like a drum. I reached the front desk, breathless and terrified, but the manor was eerily quiet once more. I glanced at the clock, 3:00 a.m. I was safe, or so I thought. As I sat there trying to calm my racing heart, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the ornate wall mirror behind the desk was not my own. It was Eleanor, her face twisted in anguish, and beside her, the man in the mirror grinning wickedly. "Welcome to your new home," he whispered, and in that moment I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't the watchman of Ashwood Manor. I was its newest prisoner. I've spent the last year working as a night security guard at the old Crescent Theater, a once grand cinema that has fallen into disrepair. Located on the outskirts of town, it has long been rumored to be haunted, a place where strange occurrences and inexplicable sounds are a nightly norm. Most nights I dismissed the stories, but that all changed one fateful evening. It was a rainy Wednesday night in late November, and I took my usual position at the front desk, watching the flickering monitors that displayed the various areas of the theater. The air was thick with the smell of mold and dust, remnants of a bygone era when patrons filled the seats to watch the latest films. Now the place was eerily empty, with only the shadows of forgotten memories. As the clock struck midnight, I began my rounds, walking through the dimly lit hallways. I checked the projection room, the lobby, and the restrooms, but each time I returned to the lobby, I felt an unsettling presence. It was as if someone or something was watching me. As I approached the main auditorium, I heard a faint sound, like the distant echo of laughter. My heart raced. I knew the theater had been closed for years, but the sound was unmistakable. Curiosity piqued. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The vast room was dark, the red velvet seats worn and dusty, but the laughter continued, now mingled with haunting whispers. "Help us! Help us!" I shone my flashlight around the auditorium, but there was no one there. The stage lay shrouded in darkness, and the only light came from the emergency exit sign flickering dimly. The laughter transformed into sobs, a chorus of sorrow that sent chills down my spine. I made my way toward the stage, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As I reached the front, I noticed something unusual, a small, ornate clock sitting on the edge of the stage. It was ticking loudly, the sound echoing in the silence. But what caught my attention was the time. It read 12:59 a.m. Before I could react, the clock struck midnight, its hands jerking violently as if caught in a time loop. The murmurs grew louder, and the theater filled with a swirling mist. I stumbled back, my heart racing as shadows began to take form, moving across the stage like dancers in a forgotten performance. "Join us!" they cried in unison, their voices rising in a haunting crescendo. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the auditorium doors slammed shut, trapping me inside. I pounded against the heavy wood, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in around me, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes hollow and pleading. "Help us! We are trapped!" I could feel the weight of their sorrow pressing down on me, and in that moment, I understood. They were souls bound to this theater, lost in a cycle of despair. I had to help them find peace. "Tell me what to do," I shouted, my voice trembling. The shadows swirled around me, and the clock began ticking faster, its hands spinning wildly. "Find the truth," they urged, their voices echoing in my mind. "Break the curse." I hesitated for a moment, then turned back toward the stage. The clock was the key. I needed to uncover its secrets. I stepped closer, reaching for it, and as I did, the whispers intensified, swirling around me like a tempest. "Find the last show," they cried, "the final countdown." With newfound determination, I grasped the clock, and the theater was suddenly plunged into darkness. I closed my eyes, focusing on the voices. I could see images flashing in my mind, scenes from the past, memories of the theater in its prime, filled with laughter and joy. But then the images shifted to a tragic event, a fire that had consumed the theater decades ago, trapping the audience inside. My heart raced as I realized the truth. The spirits were not just lost, they were victims of a tragic fate. They had never been able to leave, bound to the theater by their untold stories. "Let me help you," I shouted, gripping the clock tightly. "I'll make sure your story is told." Just then the clock began to glow, illuminating the auditorium with a warm light. The shadows paused, their expressions softening. "You can free us," they whispered, their voices merging into one. "Tell our story." With a surge of energy, the clock's hand stopped moving, and the shadows began to coalesce into a single figure, a woman in an elegant gown, her face filled with sorrow, but also gratitude. "Thank you. she said softly. "You've given us hope." The clock chimed once, and the theater erupted in a brilliant light. The shadows began to dissolve, their forms dissipating into the air like smoke. I felt a wave of warmth wash over me, and in that moment, I knew they were finally free. As the last of the light faded, I found myself alone on the stage, the clock still ticking softly in my hand. The auditorium was silent now. The oppressive weight lifted. The doors creaked open, and I stumbled out into the cool night air, my heart still pounding from the experience. I left the Crescent Theater that night forever changed. I never returned for my shifts, but I often think of the spirits who were trapped there, waiting for someone to hear their stories. I made it my mission to share what had happened, to honor their memory and ensure that their tragic fate would never be forgotten. Sometimes when the wind howls through the streets, I can still hear the whispers of the shadows, a haunting reminder of the lives lost in the theater's embrace. But I also hear their laughter, echoing in the corners of my mind, a sign that they finally found peace. I've worked as a night security guard at the old Harrington Library, a grand building filled with centuries-old books and untold stories. The library is a local landmark, known for its breathtaking architecture and sprawling collection, but it has a dark reputation. People say the library is haunted, whispers of ghostly figures roaming the aisles at night, searching for something lost to time. I never believed the tales until one fateful night in late October. The air was crisp and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows as I settled in for my shift. My routine was simple: check the cameras, walk the aisles, and make sure no one was lurking about. The library was empty, a labyrinth of shadows and silence. As I walked through the main hall, I marveled at the towering shelves filled with dusty tomes. The smell of old paper surrounded me, a comforting scent that always calmed my nerves. I made my way to the back of the library where the rare books were kept under lock and key. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like the rustling of pages. I paused, straining to listen. "Help me, please." My heart raced. I glanced around, but the aisles were empty. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I continued my patrol, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo from the rare book section. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the locked door, the heavy iron handle cold against my palm. I'd never been allowed in there alone, but something pulled me forward. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light barely illuminated the room. Rows of glass cases housed ancient manuscripts and first editions, their spines worn and faded. In the corner of the room stood an ornate wooden table, and on it lay an open book, its pages fluttering as if caught in a gentle breeze. I moved closer, my heart pounding. The book was old, bound in cracked leather with strange symbols etched into its cover. The whispering grew louder, swirling around me like a dark cloud. "Help me. Find me." I reached for the book, and as my fingers brushed against the pages, the whispers stopped. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind me. Panic surged through me, and I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. "Let me go!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the confined space. But there was only silence. I returned my gaze to the book, and to my horror, I realized the pages were now filled with words written in a language I didn't understand. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsating as if alive. The room felt charged with energy, and I could sense a presence swirling around me. "Help me find the truth," a voice whispered, softer now, almost pleading. I took a step back, fear gripping me. "What truth?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The pages began to turn on their own, revealing sketches of a young girl with dark hair and wide, sorrowful eyes. My heart sank as I recognized her. She was a local legend, a girl named Eliza who had disappeared from the town over 50 years ago. Rumors circulated that she had been searching for something in the library the night she vanished. "Find her," the voice urged, echoing through my mind. "She's trapped. You must set her free." Without thinking, I grabbed a pen from my pocket and began to jot down the symbols I saw in the book, hoping to find answers. As I wrote, the atmosphere shifted, the air growing heavy with desperation. I could feel Eliza's spirit, her longing to be remembered, to be found. Suddenly the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. I could hear soft sobbing, the sound of a girl crying. "Help me, please." I turned back to the book, frantically searching the pages for anything that might help. Then, in a rush of inspiration, I began to speak aloud the words I had written. As I did, the room filled with a brilliant light, and the whispers transformed into a cacophony of voices crying out in unison. "Set her free." The energy in the room surged, and I felt a presence standing beside me. I turned, and there she was. Eliza, her spirit shimmering like a ghostly candle. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, and she reached out to me, her hand trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice echoing like a soft breeze. "You've found me." With that, the light enveloped her and the air shimmered with energy. The sobbing faded, replaced by a sense of peace. The book in front of me closed with a resounding thud, and the door swung open, freeing me from the room. I stumbled out, breathless and shaken but relieved. I had set her spirit free. The library felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from its ancient walls. From that night on, I never doubted the stories again. Eliza's spirit lingered in the library, a guardian of knowledge and secrets, and I felt honored to have helped her find peace. I still work at the Harrington Library, and sometimes late at night, I hear her whisper in the silence, thanking me for giving her a voice when she needed it the most. And every time I walk past the rare book section, I can't help but smile, knowing that some stories are meant to be told, and some spirits are meant to be freed. I'm a night security guard at Miller Elementary School, a quaint building nestled in a quiet neighborhood. I took this job to pay off my student loans, but little did I know how much I would regret it. The school has been closed for renovations for the past year, but the administration needed someone to keep watch over the property during the ongoing construction. That's where I came in. One chilly evening in early March, I clocked in at 10 p.m., armed with my flashlight and a walkie-talkie. The halls were eerily silent, the only sound being the distant creaking of the building settling in the cold. I began my rounds, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. As I walked through the empty classrooms, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The posters on the walls, once brightly colored, now seemed faded and ghostly in the dim light. I kept reminding myself that it was just an old school, but there was an underlying tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. I made my way to the gymnasium, where the echoes of laughter and joy were replaced by an unsettling emptiness. As I stood there, I thought I heard a faint sound, a soft giggle, like that of a child. My heart raced. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing but abandoned gym equipment and dark corners. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I continued my patrol, but the giggling persisted, echoing through the hallways. Each time it sounded closer, each time sending chills down my spine. I decided to investigate, my instincts screaming at me to run. As I entered the art room, I was hit by a wave of cold air. The windows were boarded up, but I could see moonlight filtering through the gaps. I shone my flashlight around the room, illuminating scattered paint supplies and half-finished projects left behind. The giggle rang out again, this time louder, more urgent. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The giggle stopped, replaced by a soft whimper. My heart sank. I stepped closer to the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. To my horror, I saw a small figure crouched in the corner. A little girl with dark, tangled hair and a torn dress, her eyes wide and terrified. "Help me," she whispered, her voice fragile and trembling. I froze, unsure if I was seeing a ghost or if my mind was playing tricks on me. "Where are your parents?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They left me," she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm scared." I took a step closer, my instincts telling me to help her. "It's okay. I'm here now. Let's get you out of here." But as I reached out for her, she shrank back, disappearing into the shadows. I felt a chill run through me. "Wait, where did you go?" I cried out, panic rising in my chest. The room grew colder and I could see my breath in the air. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in front of me, trapping me inside. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice echoed back at me, mocking my fear. Suddenly the lights flickered and I saw her reflection in the glass of a nearby window. She was standing behind me, her face twisted in anguish. "You can't leave me," she wailed, her voice echoing in the confined space. I turned around, fear flooding my veins. "I'm not leaving you. I want to help." But she just pointed to the corner of the room, and I felt compelled to look. There, hidden under a pile of art supplies, was a worn-out teddy bear, its fur matted and eyes dull. I reached for it, and as soon as my fingers brushed against the fabric, the lights went out completely. In the darkness, the girl's laughter echoed, but it was no longer innocent. It was haunting, filled with despair. "You found him. Now you can stay with us." I fumbled for my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest. As I turned it on, the beam illuminated her once more, but she was no longer the frightened child. Her face was twisted, her eyes black voids, and her smile stretched unnaturally wide. I bolted toward the door, adrenaline surging through me. The handle turned easily, and I flung the door open, stumbling into the hallway. I raced down the corridor, the laughter following me, echoing off the walls. I reached the main entrance, my heart racing. I pushed against the heavy doors, praying they would open, and they did. I burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. I never returned to Miller Elementary after that night. I quit my job the very next day, unable to shake the feeling of the girl's presence lingering in my mind. I often wonder who she was and what had happened to her. The thought of her left alone in that dark school haunts me, a chilling reminder that some spirits are lost, forever searching for a way home. Now every time I pass by the school, I can't help but glance up at the windows, half expecting to see her watching me, waiting for me to return and join her in her eternal solitude. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear her laughter echoing through the darkness, a haunting melody that reminds me of the forgotten child. I am a night security guard at Ravenwood Library. This grand old building, with its towering shelves and intricate woodwork, was once a bustling center of knowledge and culture. However, after a series of unexplained events, books flying off the shelves, whispers echoing through the aisles, and the disappearance of a prominent librarian, the library had been closed at night, and rumors of hauntings filled the town. The locals spoke of the spirit of Eleanor Sinclair, the librarian who had dedicated her life to the library's treasures. They claimed that she still roamed the stacks, guarding her beloved books and searching for something she had lost. I took the job partly out of necessity, but I was also drawn to the stories, eager to uncover the truth behind the haunting. The first few nights were quiet, filled only with the sound of the clock ticking in the silence. But as the nights grew longer, I began to notice strange occurrences. Books would be misplaced, and I could hear the faint sound of pages turning when no one was around. The atmosphere felt charged, as if the library was alive with secrets waiting to be unveiled. One particularly stormy night, thunder rumbled outside, and rain pattered against the windows. I was making my rounds when I heard it, a soft whisper, like a distant voice calling my name. "Lily, Lily." I froze, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, but only silence replied. The whispering continued, drawing me deeper into the library. I followed the sound, weaving through the aisles of books, until I reached the historic archives section. As I entered the dimly lit room, the whispering grew louder, swirling around me like a gentle breeze. "Help me. Find it. the voice urged, filled with longing. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice shaking. The air shimmered, and suddenly a figure appeared before me, a woman in a long, flowing dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders. It was Eleanor Sinclair, just as the portraits in the library depicted her. "Eleanor," I breathed, my heart racing. "You need help?" "Yes," she replied, her voice soft and melodic. "I am bound to this place, searching for a book that holds the key to my past. Without it, I cannot find peace." "What book are you looking for?" I asked, stepping closer, feeling a deep empathy for the spirit. "It is an ancient tome, hidden among the shelves," she said, her eyes glistening with sorrow. "It contains knowledge long forgotten, and I fear it may have been lost in the chaos." "Let me help you find it," I said, my determination surging. "Where should we start?" Eleanor gestured toward the far corner of the library where the oldest books were housed. "The rare books section holds many secrets. We must search there." We moved together through the aisles, the whispers guiding us as I scanned the shelves for the hidden tome. Dust motes danced in the air, and I could feel the weight of history pressing down upon us. "It has a blue cover and a golden emblem," Eleanor said, her voice filled with hope. As I opened one of the shelves, I noticed a book that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I reached for it, brushing away the dust, and gasped as I revealed a beautifully bound volume, its cover adorned with intricate designs. "Is this it?" I asked, holding it up. Eleanor's eyes widened with joy. "Yes, that is the one." With trembling hands, I opened the book to reveal pages filled with elegant script and illustrations that seemed to come to life. As I flipped through the pages, I could feel a powerful energy emanating from the tome. "What is this?" I whispered, captivated by its contents. "It contains the history of the library and the secrets of those who have come before me," Eleanor explained, her voice filled with reverence. "It holds the knowledge I need to understand my place in this world." But just as we began to read, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and a dark shadow loomed at the entrance of the archives. "You cannot have it," a deep voice boomed, echoing in the room. "It belongs to me." I turned to see a dark figure, its form shifting like smoke, a malevolent presence that radiated anger. "You are not welcome here," I shouted, instinctively stepping in front of Eleanor. "Leave this place," the figure hissed, its voice filled with fury. "You have no right to disturb what is mine." "Eleanor needs this book," I cried, feeling the weight of her spirit behind me. "It's her past." The shadow lunged toward us, but I held my ground, clutching the book tightly. "You will not take her," I shouted, determination surging through me. Suddenly the whispers from the library grew louder, swirling around us like a tempest. "Protect her! Protect her!" they chanted, filling the air with strength. With renewed courage, I opened the book and began to read aloud, my voice steady despite the chaos. "In the heart of Ravenwood, knowledge shall reign, and those who seek the truth shall find peace." As I spoke, the light from the book illuminated the room, casting away the shadows. The dark figure recoiled, its form twisting in anger. "No, stop!" it shrieked, but I continued to read, pouring my heart into the words. With each passage, the light grew brighter, and I could feel Eleanor's presence strengthening beside me. "You can't have her!" I yelled, my voice rising above the darkness. Finally, with one last powerful declaration, I closed the book, and the light exploded outwards, engulfing the shadow. The figure shrieked in rage before vanishing into nothingness, leaving behind only silence. As the light faded, I turned to Eleanor, who stood before me, her expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "You did it, Lily," she said, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "You set me free." "What will happen now?" I asked, my heart swelling with emotion. "I can finally rest," she replied, her voice filled with warmth. "Thank you for believing in me and for helping me find my truth." With that, Eleanor began to fade, her form shimmering like a gentle breeze. "Remember the stories," she whispered, her voice echoing in the air. "They are the heart of the library." As she vanished, I stood alone in the archives, the book still clutched in my hands. The library, once filled with darkness, now felt alive with light and possibility. From that night on, Ravenwood Library was no longer a place of fear. It became a sanctuary of hope, a reminder that knowledge and stories have the power to transcend even the darkest moments. I continued my shifts, but instead of dread, I felt a connection to the library and its history, a promise to honor Eleanor's legacy and keep her spirit alive. And every time I walked through the aisles, I could still hear the whispers of the past, echoing through the pages, reminding me of the bonds we forged through stories and the light that can always be found in the darkest of places. I've been the night security guard at Eldridge Manor for the past 8 months. This sprawling estate, with its ivy-covered walls and towering spires, had once been a grand home for the wealthy Eldridge family. But after a series of tragic events, including the mysterious death of the last heir, Charles Eldridge, the manor fell into disrepair, and rumors of hauntings began to swirl in the nearby town. The locals claimed that Charles's spirit roamed the halls, unable to find peace after the tragic accident that had taken his life. They said he could be heard at night, playing the piano in the grand parlor, his melancholic melodies echoing through the empty rooms. I took the job out of necessity, but part of me was drawn to the stories, hoping to uncover the truth behind the haunting. The first few nights passed without incident, filled only with the sound of creaking floorboards and the distant rustle of leaves outside. But as the nights grew colder, I began to feel an unsettling energy in the air, a sense of being watched, as if the very walls of the manor held their breath. One particularly frigid night in late November, I was making my rounds when I heard it. The soft, haunting notes of a piano drifting through the hallway. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing against the marble floors. I turned the corner and entered the grand parlor where the old piano sat, its keys glimmering in the faint light. To my astonishment, a figure was seated at the piano, his fingers dancing gracefully over the keys. He was dressed in elegant attire, and his hair was neatly styled. I recognized him immediately, Charles Eldridge, just as the portraits in the manor depicted him. "Charles?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The music stopped abruptly, and he turned to face me, his expression a mix of surprise and sorrow. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rich and melodic, yet tinged with sadness. "I'm Rachel, the night guard," I replied, stepping closer. "I've heard the stories about you." He sighed, the weight of his history evident in his eyes. "I am trapped in this place, bound to the music I once loved. I cannot leave until I find closure." "What happened to you?" I asked gently, sensing the pain behind his words. "There was an accident," he said, his voice breaking. "I was supposed to leave for a concert, but tragedy struck. My family, they were gone, and I was left alone, burdened by the weight of my grief." I felt a surge of empathy for the young man before me. "You don't have to be alone anymore. Let me help you find peace." He looked at me, hope flickering in his eyes. "You would do that for me?" "Of course," I said, determination surging within me. "What can I do?" "The last piece I was working on, the one I never finished. I need to complete it," he explained, his voice filled with urgency. "Only then will I be free." "Let's find it," I said, eager to assist him. "Where do we start?" Charles rose from the piano, leading me through the dimly lit halls of the manor. We passed portraits of his ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow us as we moved. Finally, we reached a small study filled with dust-covered books and forgotten memories. In the corner, I spotted an old music stand, but the sheet music was missing. "Where is it?" I asked, scanning the room. "It should be here," Charles said, his brow furrowing with concern. "I remember leaving it on the stand. It was my final composition, the one I wanted to share with the world." Determined to help him find it, I started rummaging through the papers scattered across the desk. Just as I was about to lose hope, I noticed a hidden compartment in the desk's side. I pulled it open, and inside lay a crumpled piece of sheet music, yellowed with age. "This must be it," I exclaimed, holding it up. Charles's eyes lit up with joy as he took the sheet music from my hands, his fingers brushing against the notes with reverence. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Now I can finish what I started." He moved to the piano, and as he began to play, the room filled with a hauntingly beautiful melody. The notes flowed effortlessly, as if he were channeling all the emotions he had kept bottled up for so long. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, feeling the weight of his grief and longing. But as the melody reached its crescendo, the atmosphere shifted. The shadows in the room grew darker, swirling around us like a tempest. "They're here!" Charles cried, panic rising in his voice. "The spirits that keep me bound!" "Stay focused," I urged, my heart racing. "You can do this!" With determination, Charles continued to play, pouring his heart into the music. The shadows recoiled, but I could feel their presence closing in, threatening to pull him back into their grasp. "You have to finish," I shouted, my voice rising above the chaos. With one final sweep of his hands across the keys, Charles played the last note, and the room erupted in a brilliant light. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissipating as the music filled the air with warmth and hope. I felt a surge of energy enveloping us, lifting the weight of sorrow that had bound him for so long. As the final note lingered in the air, the light faded, and Charles turned to me, his expression one of pure relief. "You did it," he said, tears glistening in his eyes. "You helped me find peace." "What will happen now?" I asked, my heart swelling with emotion. "I can finally leave this place," he replied, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "Thank you for believing in me." With that, he began to fade, his form shimmering like a candle in the wind. "Remember the music," he whispered, his voice echoing in the air. "Let it guide you." As he vanished, I stood alone in the parlor, tears streaming down my face. The piano sat silent, but the echoes of his melody lingered in my heart, a testament to the bond we had forged. From that night on, Eldridge Manor was no longer a place of sorrow. It became a sanctuary of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, music can heal and bring light to the shadows of the past. I continued my shifts, but instead of dread, I felt a connection to the manor and its history, a promise to honor Charles's memory and keep his music alive. And every time the wind blew through the halls, I could still hear the faint notes of his melody, a reminder that some spirits never truly leave. They live on in the hearts of those who remember them. I've spent the last year working as a night security guard at the old lighthouse point, a remote lighthouse that stood watch over the rugged coastline. The lighthouse was once a beacon of hope for sailors navigating the treacherous waters, but after a series of shipwrecks and the mysterious disappearance of the last lighthouse keeper, the tower fell into disrepair and was largely forgotten. Locals whispered about the spirit of the keeper, said to still roam the grounds, eternally tending to the light. Despite the ghost stories, I took the job, hoping to find solace in the solitude of the lighthouse. The first few nights passed quietly, filled with the sound of waves crashing against the rocks and the distant call of seabirds. However, as the nights grew darker, I began to feel a strange presence in the air, a sense of being watched. One particularly stormy night, the wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against the lighthouse windows. My shift had been uneventful until I heard it, a soft, mournful sound that echoed through the halls, almost like a distant bell tolling. Curiosity piqued, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured up the winding staircase to the lantern room. As I reached the top, I pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the lantern room, where the massive light fixture loomed above. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flickering lantern. To my astonishment, I found a figure standing before the glass, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and cap, his hands tending to the lamp. "Excuse me," I called out, my heart racing. "Who are you?" The figure turned slowly, revealing a weathered face and deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. "I am Thomas, the keeper of this light," he said, his voice low and resonant. "I have watched over these waters for many years." "Thomas," I echoed, the name sending a shiver down my spine. You're the last keeper." He nodded solemnly. "The light is my duty, and yet it has grown dim. I cannot leave until it shines bright once more." "What happened to you?" I asked, stepping closer, a sense of empathy washing over me. "I failed to save a ship from the storm," he said, his voice thick with regret. "The sailors perished, and I have been bound to this place ever since, unable to fulfill my duty." Determination surged within me. "What can I do to help you?" Thomas looked at me, his expression softening. "You must relight the beacon. The lantern needs fresh oil, and the gears must be repaired. Only then will I be free." "Let's do it," I said, feeling a connection to the spirit of the lighthouse keeper. "Show me what to do." Together we worked tirelessly to prepare the lantern. I filled the reservoir with oil and inspected the mechanisms, guided by Thomas's steady presence. As we worked, the storm outside intensified, the wind howling and rain battering the walls. But just as we made progress, the lights began to flicker and the room grew colder. I could feel a dark energy surrounding us, an unnatural presence that seemed to seep from the shadows. "They're coming," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with urgency. "You must hurry." With renewed determination, I focused on the task at hand. I tightened screws and adjusted the gears, feeling the weight of the lighthouse's history pressing down on me. "We can do this," I urged, glancing at Thomas, who nodded in encouragement. As the clock struck midnight, the wind howled louder and the shadows in the room thickened. "They want to stop us," Thomas shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "Keep going." With one final push, I locked the last gear into place, and Thomas moved to the lantern. "Now light it," he commanded, urgency in his voice. I struck a match, and with trembling hands I ignited the wick. The flame flickered to life, and as it did, a brilliant light filled the room, illuminating every corner with warmth. The shadows recoiled, and I could hear distant cries of anger as the dark presence began to fade. As the light grew brighter, I felt a surge of energy enveloping us. The lantern shone like a beacon, cutting through the stormy night, guiding lost souls home. "It's working!" I exclaimed, tears of relief filling my eyes. "Thank you, Mia," Thomas said, his voice now filled with gratitude. "You've done it. You've set me free." As the light reached its full brilliance, Thomas began to fade, his form shimmering like a candle in the wind. "Remember to keep the light alive," he whispered, his voice echoing in the air. "Always." With those final words he vanished, leaving me standing alone in the lantern room, the lighthouse shining brightly around me. The storm outside began to calm, and the oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. From that night on, Lighthouse Point was no longer a place of fear. It became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of storms, a single light can guide lost souls home. I continued my shifts, but instead of solitude, I felt a connection to the lighthouse and the spirit of its keeper, a promise to honor his legacy and keep the light shining for all who wandered the shores. And every time the lantern illuminated the night sky, I could still feel Thomas's presence beside me, a guardian watching over the waters, forever grateful for the light that had set him free. My name is Oliver Brooks, and I've been the night security guard at Hawthorne Clock Tower for the past 6 months. The clock tower, a relic of a bygone era, had stood proudly in the town square for over a century, its intricate mechanisms and beautiful chimes once a source of pride for the community. However, after the mysterious disappearance of the clockmaker, Mr. Edwin Hawthorne, the tower fell into disrepair, and tales of a curse began to circulate among the townsfolk. They said that Mr. Hawthorne had poured his soul into the clock, and after his disappearance, the clock began to malfunction, its hands spinning wildly and chiming at all the wrong times. Some claimed that the clock was haunted by his spirit, unable to rest until the mystery of his disappearance was solved. I took the job to save up for college, but I was also drawn to the stories surrounding the tower. On my first night, the air felt thick with history, and the sound of the clock ticking echoed through the empty halls. I dismissed the ghost stories as mere folklore, but as the nights wore on, strange things began to happen. On one particularly stormy night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I was stationed near the base of the tower when I heard a faint ticking sound, different from the steady rhythm of the clock. It was coming from the upper levels. My curiosity piqued. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the narrow staircase. As I climbed higher, the ticking grew louder, almost frantic. When I reached the top, I pushed open the door to the clock room and was met with an astonishing sight. The clock was alive, its gears whirring and spinning in a chaotic dance. In the center stood a figure hunched over the clock's intricate mechanisms, his hands moving deftly as he worked. "Mr. Hawthorne?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing a weathered face and deep-set eyes. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough and gravelly. "I'm Oliver the night guard," I replied, taken aback by his sudden hostility. "What are you doing here?" "I'm fixing it," he snapped, pointing to the clock. "It's broken, and it's my fault. I must make it right." Confused, I stepped closer. "How can I help?" He looked at me, his expression softening. "You don't understand. The clock is cursed. I made a mistake, something I can't undo. I need to finish my work before it's too late." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. "I was experimenting with time," he said, his eyes filled with regret. "I thought I could create something beautiful, a way to manipulate time itself. But it backfired. Now I'm trapped here, and the clock is spiraling out of control." I glanced at the clock, its hands moving erratically, and felt a sense of dread wash over me. "Is there a way to break the curse?" He nodded slowly. "I need to reset the clock, but I can't do it alone. The gears are tangled in a web of time, and I must align them before the next chime." "Let's do it," I said, determination surging within me. "Tell me what to do." Together we worked tirelessly, unraveling the mechanisms of the clock. Mr. Hawthorne guided me, explaining the intricacies of the gears and how they worked together. As we labored, the ticking grew steadier, and I could feel the weight of the curse slowly lifting. But just as we began to make progress, the clock struck midnight, and the room filled with a deafening chime. The gears whirred violently, and the lights flickered ominously. "No, we're running out of time," Mr. Hawthorne shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Keep going," I urged, my hands moving faster as I tried to align the gears. "We can do this." With each adjustment, the ticking grew more harmonious, but the shadows in the room thickened, swirling around us like a tempest. I could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent, trying to pull us back. "Focus," Mr. Hawthorne shouted, his eyes locked on the clock. "We must finish this." With one final push, I aligned the last gear, and in that moment, the clock let out a resonating chime that echoed through the tower. The shadows recoiled, and the room filled with a brilliant light. I shielded my eyes, feeling a surge of energy wash over me. As the light faded, I turned to see Mr. Hawthorne standing before me, his expression one of relief and gratitude. "You did it," he said, his voice trembling. "You freed me." "What will happen now?" I asked, my heart racing. "I can finally rest," he replied, a smile breaking through his worn features. "Thank you for helping me break the curse." With that, he began to fade, his form shimmering like a gentle breeze. "Remember, time is precious. Cherish every moment." As he vanished, I felt a profound sense of peace enveloping me. The clock chimed once more, But this time the sound was harmonious, a beautiful melody that filled the air with warmth. From that night on, the Hawthorne Clock Tower was no longer a place of fear. It became a symbol of hope and redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, light can break through. I continued my shifts, but instead of dread, I felt a connection to the tower and its history, a promise to honor the legacy of the clockmaker who had taught me the true value of time. And as the clock chimed every hour, I could still hear his laughter, echoing through the halls, a testament to the bond that transcended even the boundaries of time itself. It all started a few years ago when I moved into an old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood. The place was beautiful, with ornate woodwork and a grand staircase. But the moment I walked through the front door, I felt an unsettling chill that never seemed to leave. The previous owner, Mrs. Hargrove, was an elderly woman who had lived there alone for decades. She had passed away just before I moved in. The real estate agent had mentioned that the house had been on the market for a long time, but no one had really been interested in it. I thought nothing of it. It was a great deal, and the charm of the house was too appealing to resist. One evening, while exploring the attic, I stumbled upon a door I had never noticed before. It was a small, unremarkable door, painted the same color as the surrounding walls. It had no handle, only a rusted keyhole. There was something eerie about it, like it was trying too hard to blend in. I was curious but thought nothing more of it, attributing it to the quirks of an old house. That is, until strange things began happening. The first sign was the whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs filled the house at night. I brushed it off as old pipes or the house settling, but it didn't stop. Every night, the whispers grew louder, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. One night I woke up to a cold hand brushing against my arm. I was alone, or so I thought. I turned on the lights and found nothing. My curiosity got the better of me, and despite the growing sense of dread, I found myself standing in front of that door again. I decided to call a local historian, Mrs. Davenport, who had an impressive knowledge of the town's lore. When she arrived, I asked her about the door. Her face turned ashen when she saw it. "That door," she said, her voice trembling, "was sealed for a reason. It's a relic of an old ritual." She explained that years ago a series of strange occurrences had plagued the house. The previous owner, a woman named Eleanor Gray, had been a practicing medium. She conducted a ritual to communicate with the spirit world, but something had gone terribly wrong. The door had been sealed to contain whatever had been summoned. Despite her warning, I couldn't ignore my own curiosity. Late one night, driven by both fear and fascination, I retrieved a small tool and managed to pry the door open. The hinges creaked, and dust fell from the frame. Inside, the room was small, barely fitting a single chair and an old tattered book on a pedestal. I picked up the book, its cover adorned with strange symbols. As I opened it, I noticed that the pages were filled with handwritten notes and drawings of grotesque figures. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the book described various rituals and entities, things that should never have been tampered with. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving behind me, shifting and writhing. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, now more distinct, forming words. "We're free. You've let us out." Panic surged through me. I fled the room, slamming the door shut and desperately trying to block it with whatever I could find. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified to even close my eyes. The next day, Mrs. Davenport came over to check on me. She was alarmed when she saw the door open and the room in disarray. She tried to convince me to leave immediately, but I was stubborn and refused to believe that things could be as bad as they seemed. That night the house seemed different. The whispers were gone, replaced by an overwhelming silence. I felt a strange sense of calm, almost like the house was holding its breath. Exhausted, I finally fell asleep. I woke up to an odd sight. The room where the door was had completely changed. It was now a normal room, decorated with old-fashioned furniture and wallpaper. The door was gone. Confused, I searched through the house, but it was as if the door had never existed. The house was peaceful for a few days, but something was off. I could never shake the feeling that I was being watched. A month later, I received a letter from Mrs. Davenport. It was brief and cryptic. "I hope you're doing well. Remember, some doors should remain closed." I decided to move out of the house shortly after. I couldn't bear the growing sense of unease and the feeling that I was not alone. The house was eventually sold again, but the new owners never reported any unusual activity. So here's the twist. I always thought I had just let something out. But years later, after doing some research, I found out that the real horror was not what was behind that door. It was what had been inside me all along, a morbid curiosity that had led me to open that door and disturb something that was better left untouched. If you ever find yourself in a situation where your curiosity outweighs your sense of danger, remember, some doors are best left closed. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. I always hated my childhood home. It was one of those old Victorian houses with creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a basement that seemed to breathe on its own. My parents loved it. They thought it had character, whatever that means. I just thought it was creepy. When my parents passed away, the house became mine. I didn't want it, but selling it felt like erasing their memory. So, I moved back in, hoping I could ignore the uneasy feeling that always lingered in the back of my mind. I was unpacking the last of my boxes when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from below. I froze, listening. It was faint, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing from the basement. I tried to shake it off. Old houses make noises, right? Pipes, settling wood, the usual. But the sound didn't stop. Thump, thump, thump. I set down the box and walked to the basement door, the air growing colder with each step. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to just turn around, to ignore it, but I couldn't, not anymore. The basement stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step echoing in the darkness. The light bulb at the top of the stairs cast a dim glow, barely enough to see by. The basement smelled like damp earth and mold, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and skin. As I reached the bottom, I saw it, a door I didn't recognize tucked into the far wall. A heavy, iron door that didn't belong in my parents' quaint Victorian home. I would have remembered if it was there before. I should have remembered. But it was unmistakably old, rusted with strange symbols carved into the metal. The thumping was louder now, coming from behind the door. I pressed my ear against it, heart racing. It was rhythmic, like a drumbeat, slow and deliberate. But there was something off about it, something that set my teeth on edge. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a loose pipe or some animal trapped behind the wall. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I pushed against the door, but it didn't budge. No handle, no lock, just a solid, unmoving slab of iron. I leaned back, debating my next move, when the door shuddered, as if something on the other side had pressed against it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then a whisper, soft and distorted, seeping through the cracks. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded pleading, desperate. I backed away, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I should have left it alone. I should have walked away. But the door called to me, the thumping syncing with my own heartbeat. I ran back upstairs and grabbed a crowbar, adrenaline fueling my every move. The iron groaned as I pried it open, flakes of rust raining down. I forced the door open just enough to peer and see, but all I saw was darkness. An inky, impenetrable void that seemed to stretch on forever. The thumping grew louder, reverberating through my chest, rattling my bones. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes glowing faintly in the dark, staring back at me. They were too far apart, too low to the ground, like something crouched, waiting. I stumbled back, dropping the crowbar, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The thumping stopped. I rushed back upstairs, my mind racing. I locked the basement door, then bolted it, then shoved a chair under the knob for good measure. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't catch my breath. What the hell was that? I couldn't get those eyes out of my mind, the way they just watched. I spent the next few days pretending everything was normal. I went to work, I ate dinner, I tried to sleep, but I could still feel the thumping, faint and distant, as if it had embedded itself into my skull. The basement was off limits. I told myself it was just my imagination, a stress-induced hallucination, but I knew better. One night I woke up to the sound of scratching, a soft, persistent scrape coming from the basement door. I pulled the covers over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, willing it to stop. But the scratching grew louder, more frantic. I could hear the thumping again, faster now, like whatever was behind that door was getting restless. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed my friend Mark, the only person who might believe me. He was a contractor, used to dealing with old houses and weird noises. I told him about the basement, the door, the eyes. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He just said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mark showed up with his toolbox and a flashlight, looking more curious than concerned. I led him to the basement door, my pulse quickening with every step. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Mark examined the door, running his fingers over the symbols. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He took out his tools and started working on the hinges, prying them loose one by one. I stood back, a knot forming in my stomach. The door fell open with a clang, revealing nothing but darkness. Mark shined his flashlight inside, the beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was empty, just bare walls and a dirt floor. No eyes, no creature, just the faint outline of old pipes and cobwebs. He turned to me, frowning. "There's nothing here, man. Maybe it was a rat or something, or the house settling. You know how these old places can be." I nodded, feeling foolish. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had let my imagination run wild. But as we climbed back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, hiding just out of sight. Mark left, reassuring me that everything was fine, that I had nothing to worry about. I tried to believe him. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. But that night, I heard the thumping again, louder than ever. I grabbed my phone and played back the recording I had made of the basement. I had set up a camera after Mark left, just to be sure. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, watching the empty basement, the stillness, the quiet. And then at 3:15 a.m., the screen flickered. A shadow moved across the frame, and the camera shook, as if something had brushed against it. I paused the video, squinting at the grainy image. There in the corner were those eyes again, watching, waiting. But this time they were closer, and the door was wide open. I bolted upright, heart pounding. I raced downstairs only to find the basement door ajar, the iron door swinging gently on its hinges. The thumping was louder now, relentless, echoing through the house. I don't know what's behind that door, and I don't think I ever will. I'm leaving this place, leaving everything behind. But as I write this, I can hear it again, the soft, rhythmic thumping, growing louder with each passing second. If you ever find yourself in my old house, whatever you do, don't go into the basement. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't look into the dark. Because whatever's in there, it's hungry, and it's waiting for you. I never intended to become a paranormal investigator. It started as a joke, an online dare, a viral video, a quick spike in followers. I'd spend a night in a haunted place, record some shaky footage, pretend to hear noises, and that was it. Easy money, easy fame. But after a while, the thrill of fake scares wore off, and my audience demanded more. Real danger, real ghosts. I guess I got what I deserved. This time it was an abandoned radio station on the outskirts of town. Closed in the 1970s after a series of unexplained deaths, the place had become a local legend. The story was that the station's last broadcast was a continuous loop of static and whispers that drove listeners insane. They said the DJ killed himself live on air, leaving nothing but dead air and his screams. Of course, I didn't believe any of it. I figured I'd spend the night, record some spooky noises, and splice in some audio effects later. Easy. I pulled up to the building around midnight, the silhouette of the crumbling station looming against the sky. The wind howled through broken windows, and the air was heavy with decay. I set up my camera on a tripod, adjusting the angle to catch the full horror of the derelict facade, and began my usual intro. Hey everyone, it's your favorite ghost hunter, Alex, back at it again with another terrifying adventure. Tonight we're at the infamous WHCR radio station, where the dead never stop broadcasting. Let's see if we can catch any voices from beyond the grave. I forced a grin and gave the camera a thumbs up before pushing through the creaky front door. The smell hit me first. Mildew and something else. Something rotten. I held my breath, focusing on the sound of my footsteps echoing through the dark hallway. The walls were covered in faded posters and yellowed newspaper clippings, mostly about the station's sudden shutdown. I scanned them with my flashlight, pretending to be interested, but I just wanted to get to the main room, the heart of the station, where the broadcast had ended so abruptly. When I found the studio, it was almost too perfect. Dusty turntables, a rusted microphone, and that old-fashioned broadcasting board covered in knobs and switches. It looked as if someone had just walked out one day and never returned. I set my camera in the corner, making sure to get a wide shot of the whole room. I knew the atmosphere would play great on video. All right, guys, I'm here in the main studio where the DJ supposedly lost his mind. If there are any spirits here with me, make yourselves known. I waited, half expecting a rat to scurry by for some cheap jump scare. But there was nothing. Just silence. I moved closer to the broadcasting board, running my fingers over the dusty controls. Something about it felt wrong, like the equipment still thrummed with an energy I couldn't quite place. Let's see if this thing still works, I muttered, flipping a few switches. To my surprise, the lights on the board flickered to life. A soft hum filled the room, followed by a crackle of static from the speakers. I grinned, knowing how great this would look on camera. But then, I heard it. A faint whisper buried beneath the static, like a voice trying to break through. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words. "Can you hear us?" I jumped back, my heart racing. That wasn't a recording. It was live. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just interference, some random radio signal bouncing off the old equipment. But the whisper grew louder, more distinct. "We've been waiting for you." I stared at the microphone, now glowing with an eerie red light. I should have turned off the equipment and left, but something compelled me to stay, to listen. The voice was hypnotic, pulling me deeper into its web. "You shouldn't have come here, Alex." The sound of my own name sent a chill down my spine. How could it know my name? I glanced back at the camera, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. Just me and the voice. "We're trapped, Alex. And now, so are you." I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, rustling the old papers on the desk. The lights flickered, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The static wasn't just noise anymore. It was words, hundreds of voices speaking at once, all pleading, all screaming. I covered my ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, clawing at my thoughts, tearing at my sanity. I stumbled back, crashing into the broadcasting board. The microphone fell to the floor, sending a high-pitched screech through the speakers. I scrambled to turn it off, but the switches wouldn't budge. The equipment was blazing hot, searing my fingers. "You can't leave, Alex. You're one of us now." The walls of the studio seemed to close in, the room spinning around me. I could see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces, reaching out for me. I backed into the corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The voices grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. And then silence. I opened my eyes and the studio was empty. The equipment was off, the lights were dead, and the camera had stopped recording. I blinked, disoriented, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? A trick of the mind? A stress-induced hallucination? I grabbed my camera and bolted out of the building, not stopping until I was safely in my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. When I got home, I pulled the footage from the camera, half expecting it to be blank. But it wasn't. The video showed everything. The walk through the station, the studio, the broadcasting board flickering to life. But then at the moment the voices started, the screen went black, just static. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through me. Maybe it was just a malfunction after all, just a creepy old building with faulty wiring. But then, as I stared at the static on the screen, I heard it. The faint whisper, the same voice from the station, crackling through my computer speakers. "You can't escape us, Alex." And in the reflection of the screen, I saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures standing behind me, watching, waiting. The last thing I heard was the sound of static as they pulled me in, the screen going dark as the camera captured my final terrified scream. Now, whenever someone plays the video, they say they can hear my voice, whispering from the other side, trapped in the endless loop of that final broadcast. If you're watching this, I'm already gone, and now I'm waiting for you.